There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
This video was made possible due to those who support me on Patreon. I'd like to give a big shout out to patrons Chris Hutchison, Dan Ray, Flake, Joseph Abrams, Majin Weeaboo, Ness Lee, and Stephen Dillon. Thank you all for your support. I can't say that I wasn't initially skeptical about finally checking out Bryan Fuller's 2013 series, Hannibal, chronicling the wacky shenanigans of pop culture's most beloved psychopathic cannibal, though I suppose that isn't exactly a crowded field, for two main reasons. One, while the work of Thomas Harris, creator of the character of Hannibal Lecter and author of all 4 novels in which he appears, includes some widely acclaimed storytelling, the saga as a whole is, how should I say, of shockingly uneven quality. Granted, I can't lay the reason for this solely at the feet of Harris. We'll discuss that later. And 2, the series was not to air on, say, one of the more prestigious and revered premium channels, but rather...
This has to be a joke! I cannot believe this is happening!
Now, before any Weisenheimers out there try to insinuate that I have some sort of bias against network television, to such a baseless accusation I retort, yes, that is true, you are correct. I am working on it with my therapist. Yet I am elated to report that I have had said bias brutally dispelled, as a result of bearing witness to one of, if not the, most outlandish, most bloodiest, most astounding series to ever grace a single-digit station. Its audaciousness leaving me utterly awestruck and only able to muster the words,
I can't believe this story you're telling me. It's macabre.
There, I used the fucking clip. I've been aware of the clip, I just haven't been able to find a way to put it in another video. But now I have. Stop fucking emailing it to me. You fucking... This video will serve as a complete analysis of the series, beginning with the review of each of the 5 film adaptations of the 4 novels that feature Hannibal Lecter, followed by a breakdown of all 3 seasons, and ending with a conclusion where I outline the absolute shit show that was the conception of the source material, thus giving deeper context as to what the show was up against when it set out to translate it to the screen. While I will be offering praise to the show's phenomenal acting and stellar production, my main focus will be examining how the show operates as a comprehensive adaptation of Harris's work, in that it not only honors and expands on the source material, but was able to take bits and pieces of character and narrative, slice and dice them in macabre fashion, and reconstruct them into what I consider the definitive Lecter tale. While I will be highlighting many references the show makes to the source material, I won't be going over every single one. Rather, I'm going to focus on the more substantial narrative beats. Otherwise, this video would just be 8 hours of me going,
Last time someone rang my doorbell this early, it was a census taker.
And, of course, major spoiler warning for the entire series, as well as all 4 novels and 5 films in the Lecter franchise. The only exception would be the CBS sequel series to The Silence of the Lambs entitled Clarice, both because I didn't consider watching it necessary since the character of Clarice Starling does not appear in NBC's Hannibal, but also, and primarily because
I don't want to,
since I heard it was ass. Anyway, with all that said, let's dig in. I'm going to start off by giving a rundown/review of each of the 5 film adaptations of Harris's novels, in order to establish the major players and events of what I will dub the Lecterverse. Since they're all largely faithful to the source material, I'll mostly be using the films as a visual reference point, though I will note several changes that the films make throughout the video. We begin in 1986 with Michael Mann's Manhunter, which tells the story of FBI criminal profiler Will Graham, who possesses a disturbingly keen ability to empathize with the psychopathic mind. While said ability makes him adept at understanding and ultimately catching the killers he is tasked with bringing to justice, he is tormented by the horrifying thoughts and perspectives he welcomes into his mind. 5 years following his retirement, Will's former mentor, head of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, Jack Crawford, calls upon him to aid in the hunt for a serial killer known as the Tooth Fairy, in actuality, a disturbed film technician by the name of Francis Dollarhide. As Will once again invites the twisted psyche of the killer into his head, he desperately attempts to take his prey down before it costs him his family as well as his sanity. The film is an adaptation of Harris's 1981 novel Red Dragon, which serves as the main inspiration for the television series, and in which many of the show's primary characters make their debut. Those I have already mentioned, Will Graham and Jack Crawford, as well as director of the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, Frederick Chilton, disreputable tabloid reporter Freddie Lounds, and, of course, former forensic psychiatrist and cannibalistic serial killer Hannibal Lecter, played to abominable perfection by the great Brian Cox, and whose name is spelled with an extra K in the film for some reason. Prior to the events of the novel, Will was nearly killed during his apprehension of Lecter, an experience that left him both physically and mentally scarred, which in turn led to his retirement. Will resolves that he must visit with Lecter once again in order to enhance his insight into the mind of the Tooth Fairy, even as said reunion with his would-be killer leaves him shaken and disturbed. Now, I know I caught a bit of flack on one of my recent community posts where I implied that my feelings towards the film were of the lukewarm variety. Despite Manhunter receiving mixed critical reception upon its release, it has been regarded more positively in the decade since, its visual style and emphasis on criminal profiling and forensic evidence being hugely influential on the police procedural genre, paving the way for countless films and shows, most notably CSI: Crime Scene Investigation, starring William Peterson, who originated the role of Will Graham. However, while I consider it an overall strong film, I have a number of gripes, some of which I'll bring up later, but for now, let me lay out a few. First, there is the matter of how the film omits the more prominent aspects of Dollarhide's pathology, namely the childhood abuse he suffered at the hands of his grandmother, which led to him becoming obsessed with the William Blake painting titled The Great Red Dragon and The Woman Clothed with the Sun, and later adopting an alternate violent personality known as the Great Red Dragon. Throughout the novel, there is great emphasis put on Dollarhide's mental anguish as he desperately tries to prevent the dragon from making him kill Reba, a blind coworker of his whom he has fallen for, thus painting him as more complex and at times even sympathetic. Up to a point, of course. But in the film, while references to the Red Dragon are still scattered about, this struggle between his warring personalities is drastically scaled back. Initially, I thought this was why the title was changed to Manhunter, but in fact they did so because, 1. Michael Cimino's crime thriller Year of the Dragon, which was released the previous year, was a box office bomb, and the producers didn't want anyone to think the films were related. And 2, they didn't want anyone to mistake it for a Bruce Lee film, which I don't really get because I would pay stacks to see Bruce Lee hunting down serial killers. Regardless, Thomas Noonan's portrayal of Dollarhide is excellent, conjuring a character who is both pitifully sad yet horrifyingly unpredictable. Secondly, and this is strictly a personal preference, I fucking loathe the 80s aesthetic, and Manhunter is like if the anthropomorphic manifestation of the decade itself blew a 4-day load all over the film print. I half expected Don Johnson and Philip Michael Thomas to roll up for an assist at some point. Perhaps as a side effect of said aesthetic, Mann apparently felt as if he needed to inject more action in the film compared to the novel. But all this did was result in several unintentionally funny moments. For example, when Graham is confronted by Freddie Lounds, pestering him for information, instead of just raising his voice at him like he does in the novel, or like just grabbing him to get him to shut up or something, he like judo flips him onto the hood of a car, shattering the windshield. And, of course, there is the final showdown. Okay, so Will sees through a window that Dollarhide has Reba with a piece of glass to her throat, right? Okay, so in this situation, do you A, open fire at Dollarhide, B, quietly flank him so you can get a better shot, or C, inexplicably just fucking Braveheart charge through the glass window in slow motion with in a Oh, geez, I have to pronounce this. With In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida blaring in the background. Utterly ridiculous and impractical? Yes. Rad as hell? Also yes. However, while it isn't my own personal cup of tea, the film is definitely still worth a watch, so check it out if you haven't already. But now we come to what should be everyone's cup of tea. The film that made Hannibal the Cannibal a household name, Jonathan Demme's 1991 masterpiece, The Silence of the Lambs, based on Harris's 1988 novel of the same name. FBI trainee Clarice Starling is assigned by Jack Crawford to gain insight from the incarcerated Hannibal Lecter in an attempt to locate the serial killer dubbed Buffalo Bill, aka James Gumb, who skins the young woman he kidnaps and kills. But when Gumb kidnaps Catherine Martin, daughter of U.S. Senator Ruth Martin, Clarice races against the clock to prevent her from becoming Bill's next victim. If you were to ask me for an example of a perfect film, The Silence of the Lambs might just fit the bill. There is Ted Talley's immaculately tight screenplay, Jonathan Demme's masterful direction, the across-the-board incredible acting, Hopkins, Foster, and Levine all turning in their own tour de force. Not much else to add. It's great. You know it's great. If you haven't seen it, this is your sign. You need to get on that shit immediately. And unfortunately, that's about it for the good adaptations. The rest of the bunch ranging from hopelessly bland to egregiously insulting. First up, we have 2001's Hannibal, an adaptation of Harris's direct sequel to The Silence of the Lambs, published in 1999. 10 years following her apprehension of James Gumb and her interactions with Hannibal Lecter, now at large following his escape towards the end of Silence, Clarice Starling has her reputation disgraced following a botched drug raid, in part due to the sabotage of corrupt Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Justice Department and grade-A shit-eating asshole Paul Krendler. Shortly thereafter, Clarice is contacted by egregiously wealthy business heir and sadistic pedophile Mason Verger, who was left disfigured and paralyzed following an encounter with Lecter years previous. Seeking vengeance, Mason plans to use Clarice to help him locate Lecter, who has assumed a new identity in Italy, and feed him to a pack of wild boars. The film chronicles the hunt for Lecter, all building to the inevitable reunion between him and Starling. So, yeah, this one is just bad for a number of reasons, but most of which are as a consequence of the quality of the source material. For context, Demme, Talley, and Foster, despite all being offered the chance to return for the sequel, refused to do so after reading the novel. So, yeah, just let that simmer for now. We'll come back to it. Ridley Scott took over directing duties, and for some reason decided to forgo Demme's more subdued, restrained style for an insufferably over-the-top, quasi-action take on the film, with a lot of obnoxious cuts and quick flashes that neutralize any sense of dread or tension. Case in point, remember the brilliant moment in The Silence of the Lambs when Chilton shows Clarice a picture of the nurse that Lecter disfigured, where the audience is never shown the horrific aftermath and simply has to picture it themselves based on Clarice's disturbed reaction and Chilton's classic line,
"His pulse never got above 85, even when he ate her tongue."
Well, what if we actually did show the nurse getting attacked, but via really shitty surveillance camera footage? Ooh, and let's pair it with a gaudy-ass jump scare sound effect. Bravo, Ridley. Bravo. Julianne Moore takes up the mantle of Clarice, and, while she isn't bad, I guess, she is given the impossible task of filling the shoes of one of the most iconic film heroines of all time. Furthermore, I actually think having Hopkins reprise his role without Foster hurt the film even more than if they just replaced Hopkins too, since the entire film builds to Hannibal and Clarice finally coming face to face once again. However, as I said, the main reason the film is a dud is because the source material is utter trash. So much so that not even the combined efforts of Steve Zalian and David fucking Mamet could turn it into something worthwhile. Probably the biggest strike against it is the fact that Clarice and Lecter are separated for the vast majority of the tale. I get that Lecter is on the run and that the story is meant to build to their reunion, but it takes forever to get there, with us spending most of our time on a pointless subplot where corrupt Italian chief of police, Rinaldo Pazzi, tries to apprehend Lecter to collect the bounty Verger put on his head. only to have Lecter perform a horrendously inept appendectomy on him before yeeting him out of a window. You could cut at least 45 minutes from the film, full stop, and lose nothing of value. To make matters worse, despite all the time spent building to the showdown between Hannibal and Clarice, the film goes out with a whimper. After Lecter is goaded into returning to the States and is nabbed by Verger, Clarice, wanting Lecter to face justice rather than being killed, frees him and is then knocked unconscious. Hannibal convinces Verger's attendant to toss Verger into the boar pit where he is eaten alive. Lecter then brings Clarice to Krendler's lake house and prepares to feed her his brains. But Clarice resists, handcuffing Lecter, who then proceeds to cut off his own hand and escape. Again, the film ending with Lecter on the run, again. So yeah, the film basically ends exactly where we started, nothing having changed whatsoever. However, to the film's credit, this lackluster non-ending was undoubtedly an improvement over the book's conclusion, which, hoo boy. So, in adapting the novel, there were 3 major changes made for the film. The first being the omission of Margot Verger, Mason's lesbian bodybuilder sister. A victim of physical and sexual abuse at the hands of Mason since childhood, Margot, who is infertile, plots to steal Mason's sperm so she can have a male child with a surrogate, therefore circumventing Mason's status as sole heir and inheriting her family's fortune. It is actually her who ends up killing Mason, not by feeding him to his own boars, but by shoving one of his own pet eels down his throat. But of course, not before stimulating his prostate with a cattle prod and stealing some of her bro's spunk. Yeah, it gets weird. There is also an absurd subplot where Margot forms like a nutty-ass friendship with Barney, who was the orderly who attended to Lecter while he was incarcerated, but now works for Mason. And like they work out together, and like Barney tries to fuck her in the shower, but she rejects him. Dude, I don't even know. Margot does appear in the television series, but is depicted in a more grounded manner. We'll follow up with her later on. The second major change would be the omission of any and all references to Misha Lecter, Hannibal's younger sister. In the novel, we learn that after their parents were killed in World War II Lithuania, Hannibal and Misha, left to fend for themselves, had their home overrun by a band of deserters, who, facing starvation, murder and cannibalize Misha, leaving Hannibal traumatized, the implication being that this was the event that resulted in Hannibal becoming a cannibal killer himself. So, here's the issue with this. While both Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs do go into great detail about the pathologies of Francis Dollarhide and James Gumb respectively, explaining what made them resort to their socially frowned upon hobbies, I would argue that the entire point of Hannibal as a character is that he really isn't supposed to have a pathology. Yes, he has certain traits, such as his distaste for discourtesy, and obviously being an extremely picky eater, but why Hannibal is a cannibalistic psychopath is never really explained or really even hinted at. Again, that's sort of the point. Him written as less of a fleshed out character and more of a manifestation of evil itself, similar to, say, Judge Holden from Blood Meridian. He is beyond logic or explanation. He is not a puzzle that can be solved, he just is. This is brought up explicitly several times throughout the franchise.
What the psychologists say was wrong with Lecter?
Psychologists call him a psychopath. They don't know what else to call him.
Some kind of vampire?
They don't have a name for what it is.
There is literally an entire passage in The Silence of the Lambs where Hannibal states this almost verbatim, God damn it. Therefore, adding in the whole Misha backstory strips from Hannibal this disturbing ambiguity, contradicting the entire essence of his character. In the novel, it is implied that the reason Hannibal is initially drawn to and becomes so obsessed with Clarice is that she reminds him of Misha, and he wants her to take her place in a sense. Whereas in the film, he just sort of has the hots for her, which is still stupid, but at least they had the good sense to omit Misha altogether. And alas, now we come to the third and final major change, which is... Okay. So, before I begin, I need to be clear. These are the actual events of the actual novel that was actually published. I need to make that clear. This is not like This is not like stupid bullshit fan fiction or like some like, you know, Wattpad or whatever. Okay, this is real. Okay, good. Here we go. So in the novel, after Clarice frees Hannibal and Hannibal carries her off, instead of going to Krendler's boathouse, Hannibal takes Clarice to his own home, where he proceeds to brainwash her via the use of drugs and hypnosis, culminating in him digging up her father's corpse, which Clarice, under the influence of said drugs and hypnosis, thinks is actually alive, therefore allowing her to express all the pent-up rage and resentment she still holds for him, which ultimately allows her to reconcile the trauma his death inflicted upon her. And then comes the scene where Hannibal kidnaps Krendler and serves up his brains for dinner. But unlike in the film, where Clarice is utterly disgusted,
What the fuck?
Beef juice in the house. This is your brains on drugs.
she happily partakes. Later, Lecter tells Clarice that his goal is to basically erase her mind and have her take on the identity of Misha. But then Clarice is like, well, why can't we both exist together in this one body or something? And then proceeds to offer her breasts to Hannibal, and then, yeah. The ending of the book jumps ahead 3 years, where Clarice and Hannibal, who has made peace with Misha's death and no longer wants to imprint her onto Clarice, have run off together as lovers, who spend their time learning new languages and dancing. And as for their intimate life, in perhaps what is one of the most egregious and stomach-churning lines of the series, nay, literature as a whole, Harris writes, "Sex is a splendid structure they add to every day." Suffice to say, both fans and critics were none too pleased, them taking umbrage with Harris having Clarice act so utterly out of character in order to facilitate a shock ending. However, to be fair, I don't even really know if the issue here is that Clarice acts out of character, since it is implied that Hannibal basically destroys her mind with a combo of drugs and hypnosis. So I don't even know if I can really say the character the book refers to as Clarice is even the Clarice we know, as opposed to just an empty husk which Clarice's character once occupied. Also, what makes this even dumber is the fact that at no point does Clarice show any sign that she feels any sort of deeper respect or kinship with Lecter, her being utterly disgusted and revolted by him at every turn. So the idea that, even if you throw in the drugs and hypnosis, that she would ever have any sort of relationship with him, let alone a romance, is patently absurd. Now, had Clarice been shown to demonstrate a level of kinship with Hannibal, or at least see a part of herself reflected in him, then I could see them developing some sort of deeper personal or intimate relationship at some point down the line. Gee, I wonder if this hypothetical dynamic is going to become relevant later in the video.
Did you just smell me?
Anyway, it's an absolutely ass ending and was the primary reason why Dem, Tally, and Foster declined to return, with Foster going so far as to state that she felt the ending was a betrayal of Clarice. It's a bad movie based on a horrendous book. I wouldn't recommend either one of them. On a less negative note, a year later saw the release of Red Dragon, the second film adaptation of Harris's 1981 novel. Like Manhunter, Red Dragon is very faithful to the source material, and I'd say even offers a few improvements over both the novel and Mann's film. Namely the opening scene where it implies that Graham and Lecter had a professional relationship before Will discovered Lecter's true nature, and Ray Fiennes' portrayal of Dollarhide. Not only is Fiennes' take on the character more book accurate, Dollarhide in the novel is said to be, instead of tall and lanky, jacked as fuck, but it also takes the time to show him struggling with his alternate persona. Red Dragon also sticks to the novel's original ending. Instead of Will taking out Dollarhide at Dollarhide's crib, Dollarhide fakes his own death and tries to kill Will and his family at Will's home, it being Will's wife Molly, who ends up capping his ass. However, that's about it for prose. Edward Norton is a fine actor, but his portrayal of Will Graham really misses the mark. It's as if Norton didn't really get Will as a character, playing him as more of your run-of-the-mill straight man archetype as opposed to a dude on the brink of a mental breakdown. Then there are the added Lecter scenes. While Lecter appears sparingly in both the novel and in Manhunter, amounting to about 10 minutes of screen time, he has 25 in Red Dragon. Mind you, he only has about 16 in Silence, which I would presume was meant to satiate fan expectations of Hopkins reprising his iconic role, but I don't have to presume because screenwriter Ted Talley has said that is exactly why the extra Lecter scenes were added into the film. Though he did consult with Harris when writing said scenes, so that's pretty cool. But the issue is that it's just too much. I would argue that, at least in Harris's saga, Lecter works best as more of a peripheral character, us dreading having to once again be subjected to his piercing perception. Him being on screen too often ends up dulling his impact. Also, the final scene where it sets up the beginning of Silence is so silly. Like, it's not even sequel bait because the film was released 10 years previous. However, the biggest strike against Red Dragon is that it's just kind of bleh. Like, I might not be a fan of the over-the-top aesthetic of Manhunter, but at least it had some sense of style and energy. Red Dragon is just so bare bones, helmed by the creative and visionary prowess of, Brett Ratner. I guess if the continuity of Hopkins playing Lecter is important to you, you might dig this one, but otherwise I would recommend Manhunter any day of the week. And now, we unfortunately have to talk about 2007's Hannibal Rising, based on the 2006 novel of the same name, a prequel that showcases Hannibal's backstory, the death of his parents, and Misha's murder and consumption at the hands of a group of Nazi cannibals. Years later, Lecter moves to Paris and ends up chilling with his widowed aunt, Lady Murasaki, who he has a very weird relationship with, and eventually decides to hunt down the men who killed Misha. Which, okay, like, what are we doing here? I already went over how giving Hannibal a backstory at all is sort of a fool's errand, but now we're framing him as some sort of quasi-heroic avenger? He's hunting Nazi cannibals, for fuck's sake. Also, they add in that not only did Hannibal witness Misha being eaten, but that he also partook in chowing down on her, which, like, I don't know if this was meant to make us more sympathetic to him, even though it makes his pathology that much more confusing, but wait, why am I putting so much effort into explaining this to you? Don't bother with the film, let alone the novel, which it almost feels like Thomas Harris was coerced into writing. Wait, hold on, you're telling me that he basically was coerced into writing it? Maybe we'll dive into that whole mess towards the end of the video. But for now, with the main events and players of the Lecterverse established, let's talk Hannibal. Our pilot opens with Will Graham being approached by Jack Crawford of the Bureau's Behavioral Science Unit to recruit him in the search for a cannibal serial killer dubbed the Minnesota Shrike. Despite Will, having stepped away from fieldwork due to the mental toll it was taking on him, insisting that he is not prepared to return, Will reluctantly agrees to aid Jack in the search. Concerned about Will's mental well-being, Jack asks Will's friend and colleague, psychology professor Alana Bloom, for advice. Alana recommends having Will see a psychiatrist, namely an associate of hers. Enter Dr. Hannibal Lecter, who, unbeknownst to everyone, is a cannibalistic serial killer himself. Jack has Hannibal survey and attend to Will, Hannibal taking an immediate and mysteriously keen interest in him, while Will continues his search for the Shrike. Will comes to suspect that the Shrike is a man named Garrett Jacob Hobbs, and plans to confront him. However, Hannibal calls Hobbs and warns him of Will's impending arrival. When Will arrives at Hobbs' home, he finds that Hobbs has slit his wife's throat. Will enters to find Hobbs with a knife to the throat of his daughter, Abigail. Hobbs cuts Abigail's throat and is then shot dead by Will. The episode ends with Will and Hannibal tending to the wounded but alive Abigail in the hospital. Now, the reason I wanted to give a rundown of the pilot is to set the stage to explore the various creative choices Fuller and his team make right out of the gate, that both echo the source material while taking the story in a wildly unpredictable direction. The first element that stands out is that not only is the show framed as an apparent prequel to Red Dragon, with Will still working as a profiler for the FBI, but the show establishes Will and Hannibal having a professional and personal relationship prior to Will's discovery of Hannibal's true nature, a deviation from the novel, in which Will and Hannibal have no prior relationship. Rather, Will, while investigating a murder, simply questions Lecter, who, upon realizing Will has discovered he is the killer, almost kills him before being apprehended. This subsequently leads to Will's retirement and Hannibal's incarceration. The idea of Will and Hannibal having a prior professional relationship was first introduced in the 2002 film adaptation of the novel, where it is established Will has been consulting with Lecter on cases for some time prior to their deadly altercation. Ironically, what I consider to be the most redundant installment in the entire saga is the origin of one of its most interesting creative decisions that may or may not have led to the series utilizing it. Another interesting element is how the series expands the impact of Will's killing of Garrett Jacob Hobbs. While the circumstances of Will's encounter with Hobbs is similar to how it plays out in Red Dragon, albeit sans the presence of Hannibal, this is merely told to us as exposition. Yes, the book does note how impactful this was on Will's mental state, him being committed to a mental institution for a short time afterward, but it feels more like an afterthought, whereas in the series, Hobbs remains a specter that haunts Will throughout the course of the entire season. We aren't just told the mental impact his death is having on Will, we are forced to bear witness to it. Following his killing of Hobbs, Will finds himself becoming increasingly unstable, which is only exacerbated as he continues to work with Jack in hunting down numerous other psychopathic killers, as well as the intervention of Hannibal, who seems to be deliberately exacerbating Will's mental instability for unclear reasons. Despite my predilection for hyper-serialized storytelling, the narrative lends itself incredibly well to an episodic format. Throughout the first season, Will confides in Hannibal both his insights into the minds of the killers he seeks, them acting as a sort of profiling duo, as well as his fear that he has now attained a taste for killing himself. Their bond growing, tension building as we anticipate Will discovering Hannibal's true nature, as well as learning Hannibal's reason for being so drawn to the inner workings of Will's mind, as well as why he seems so intent on pushing it to its absolute limit. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of the season, let's talk about the show's take on the characters, beginning with Hugh Dancy's incredible and definitive portrayal of Will Graham. While obviously Lecter is the more well-known character among your average pop culture fan, Red Dragon is undoubtedly the story of Will Graham, a man torn between his desire to use his insight into the psychopathic mind to save the innocent and the fear that if he continues to do so, it will cost him his own sanity. The hunt for Francis Dollarhide is simply a vehicle to explore Will's declining mental state and its impact on his ability to live a normal life. Unfortunately, it seems like both film adaptations didn't really get this. Case in point, the fact that both films forego the novel's ending. In both film adaptations, following Will apprehending Dollarhide, he returns to living peacefully with his family, it being a happily ever after sort of deal. But in the novel, Will and Molly's relationship deteriorates over the course of the story, and following Dollarhide breaking into their home and Molly being forced to kill him, it is implied that Molly plans to leave Will, us learning in The Silence of the Lambs that Will has been left irreparably scarred and is now an alcoholic. The story is a tragedy of Will falling victim to the evil of the world. It's dark, it's brutal, but that's the story. But this seems to have been lost in regard to both film adaptations, most evidently in Red Dragon. Despite him being such a renowned, acclaimed actor, it really feels like Norton, whether due to his own interpretation of the character or Ratner's direction, just didn't get this. Him playing Graham as more of your run-of-the-mill straight man. Will's extreme mental turmoil and anguish is barely, if at all, on display. It makes the story feel as if it is more concerned with both Hannibal and Dollarhide, with Will more or less a peripheral character, which is the opposite of how the novel plays out. In contrast, Peterson demonstrates that he truly understands Will, his emotional distress on full display. However, for me, there are two big strikes against Peterson's portrayal. neither of which is really his fault. The first being man's inability to demonstrate said distress visually. In the novel, we are given access to Will's thoughts. Thus, we fully comprehend the mental impact his occupation is having on him. However, instead of finding ways to portray this visually, man instead opts to have Peterson, just kind of yell Will's inner monologues from the novel.
Didn't you, you son of a bitch? You touched her with your bare hands, and then you put your gloves back on. But while your gloves were off, did you open all her eyes so that they could see you? And after a while, you climbed down and you went into them, didn't you? Didn't you, you son of a bitch? You watched them all goddamn day long.
Peterson really goes for it, but there's really only so much you can do before it comes off as a bit goofy.
You took off your gloves to touch her, didn't you? Didn't you, you son of a bitch? You touched her with your bare hands. I did it!
And the second strike is that William Peterson is just so based looking. Look at this motherfucker. Dude just oozes cool, which I find works against being able to view him as a man on the brink of madness. Will isn't supposed to be a straight man. He isn't supposed to be smooth as ice. He's supposed to be a fucked up little freak. Enter Hugh motherfucking Dancy, who not only blows Peterson and Norton out of the water with his take on Will, but I will go even so far as to say, like Jodie Foster did with Clarice Starling, exceeds the character on the page. When we first meet Will, he is not some normal, level-headed dude. He is not some brooding badass. He is awkward, standoffish, self-isolating. He struggles to make eye contact. He looks like he'd have a panic attack at the sight of his own shadow. Exactly how you'd expect someone who makes a living by taking on the perspective of psychopaths to actually act. Will's disgust, his fear, his torment exudes from every fiber of Dancy's performance. In conjunction with Hugh's incredible turn, Fuller visually demonstrates Will's ability in terrifying fashion. Will can't just think like the killer to adopt their perspective, he must become the killer. He must feel his own hands around the victim's neck. He must witness them beg for mercy and watch as the life fades from their pleading, horrified eyes. These sequences are incredibly visceral, allowing us to understand just how taxing utilizing said ability is for Will, and how, the more he does so, the farther his mind slips into madness. A perfect symbiosis of performance and filmmaking. Also, since we are talking about Will's ability, now is a good time to discuss how the show explores what exactly said ability is and expands on it in contrast to the novel. So earlier I mentioned that Will's ability allows him to empathize and take on the perspective of the killers he pursues. Yet the exact nature of said ability is never really fully explained. Will himself likens it to simply an overactive imagination. The show introduces the possibility that perhaps Will being somewhere on the spectrum may have something to do with it, and then there is of course the implication that Will has psychopathic tendencies himself. But again, it's never explicitly fleshed out. However, one possibility that I feel the show may imply is that there is some sort of supernatural aspect to it. In many cases, the information that Will is able to derive from a crime scene is almost nonsensical, or at the very least, stretches credibility. It's almost as if Will is able to tap into some sort of evil hive mind, if you will, to enter some alternate realm. This is simply my own interpretation of the nature of Will's perception. However, I find it introduces a deeper implication to the story, turning what is more or less a plot device into a dark revelation about humanity itself. Is it the case that everyone has the capability to tap into said realm, to unearth their more sadistic, depraved, evil side? They just need to allow themselves to push past the boundaries of their own psyche, to step over the edge. Perhaps this is why Hannibal is so drawn to Will. Him seeing that as Will gets closer to reaching said edge, he can be the one to finally tip the scales and force Will to reach his breaking point. Speaking of which, now it's time to discuss Mads Mikkelsen's brilliant take on everyone's favorite cannibalistic psychopath. While I cited Hugh Dancy's performance as Will Graham to be the definitive portrayal of the character, I wouldn't say the same for Mickelson's portrayal of Hannibal Lecter. Not because it is in any way inferior, but rather each of the three actors who have portrayed the role bring their own interpretation of the character to the screen. While Anthony Hopkins is undoubtedly the most iconic, many novel fans will contend that his interpretation of Hannibal deviates from his depiction in the source material, with Hopkins portraying the character as more sadistic and even gleeful and indulging in his sick pleasures, like a devilish serpent who takes great joy in tormenting and consuming his prey. Hopkins solidifies the distinct contrast between the more cultured and reserved mask he puts on for the world to blend in and the sinister viper that truly exists within him. This is in contrast to Lecter's demeanor in the novels, which could be described as colder, less animated, more stoic and callous. Because of this, many novel fans will cite Brian Cox's take on the character as more faithful to the source material. With Hopkins, I couldn't help but be compelled to want to see him on screen again, there being something hypnotic about him, the operatic flair he brings to the character a delight to bear witness to. But with Cox, I find his presence uncomfortable, disturbing. You get the sense that Cox's Lecter wouldn't take all that much pleasure or glee in killing you. He wouldn't even pay you that much mind, seeing you as nothing more than a minor inconvenience in the way of his own freedom or a delicious meal. In that sense, I find Cox's take more grounded and realistic, yet that much more terrifying in the sense that you could encounter him on the street, hiding in plain sight behind a polite smile, unaware that there is not even a glimmer of humanity or remorse behind his eyes. Mickelson's take on Lecter I would describe as sort of a hybrid between Hopkins and Cox's takes on the character. Him possessing Hopkins' flair for the theatrical, a taste for the exquisite and sophisticated, and Cox's cold, stone-faced demeanor. You not being able to decide if you should be charmed or intimidated in his presence. Another deviation from the source material that the show takes is Lecter's physicality. In the novel, him being described more on the smaller side, with both Hopkins and Cox matching this general physical description. However, Mickelson's tall, formidable build makes him all the more imposing. However, where I feel Mickelson stands alone is in his almost alien, childlike curiosity about humanity itself. We see this evident in his seemingly random actions throughout the first season. Case in point, him warning Garrett Jacob Hobbs about Will's impending arrival. We later learn that Hannibal didn't have any particular motivation in doing so. He simply wanted to see what would happen. In that sense, combining his cold indifference to the fates of others and his interest in the complexities of human nature, it makes him akin to a scientist toying with those around him like specimens in a petri dish, or, perhaps more aptly, a little kid with a magnifying glass, fascinated to see how the ants will behave when subjected to the sun's scorching heat. It is this ambiguity in regard to Hannibal's motivations that makes Season 1 that much more enthralling, us eager to discover what ultimate goal he is aiming for, if any. Does he want to push Will into borderline psychosis for shits and giggles, or does he want to see what Will is truly capable of? Is he deliberately setting Will up to take the fall for his own crimes, or is it simply a sort of insurance policy in case Will catches on to him? This in turn explains why it is so difficult for Will to see the truth about the man that he, despite his initial resistance, comes to trust and confide in more than perhaps anyone else. Will's ability allows him to understand the motivations of the killers he hunts. But how can he even begin to comprehend someone who has no quantifiable pathology? How can he see a man who by every human metric doesn't even exist? And yet, could the common element that threads his seemingly random actions together be, despite the carefully cultivated persona he has crafted, despite the extreme lengths he goes to conceal his true nature from those around him, a desire for someone to bear witness to who he truly is beneath the mask, and accept him in spite of it? Perhaps this is what Hannibal is aiming for by pushing Will to the brink of madness, him believing he has finally found someone who can see him as he is. As we later learn, Will is not the first person who Hannibal has urged to lean into their darker impulses. But perhaps he is not doing so for sheer amusement. Well, maybe a little. But rather out of a desire to find someone he can share himself, his total self, with. And he sees that person in Will. Someone who he believes can understand him, perhaps even more than he understands himself. It is this element that makes the show's take on Hannibal so special, adding a level of complexity that makes the relationship between him and Will that much more gripping and captivating. But Will and Hannibal are not the only characters Fuller brings a new lens to, the show delivering what I consider to be far and away the definitive portrayal of Jack Crawford by the fantastic Laurence Fishburne, who perfectly balances a more warm and fatherly demeanor with that of a man who was teetering on the edge of mayhem itself, us seeing a far darker side of the character than the source material would dare venture into. While the character of Jack Crawford has been portrayed by some fantastic actors, Dennis Farina, Scott Glenn, and Harvey Keitel, unfortunately, a consequence of adapting a work of literature to the medium of film is that, in most cases, supporting characters don't get as much love. While this can be good in some cases, it's quite a shame that Crawford doesn't get as much development in the films as he does in the novels, namely the subplot in The Silence of the Lambs, in which Crawford struggles to cope with his wife Bella suffering with terminal cancer, though I understand why they cut it from the film for pacing reasons. However, due to the show allowing for the expanding of the supporting players, we get a lot more to chew on from Jack. In the novels and films, Jack more or less is a background player who stirs either Will or Clarice into action and mostly sticks to the sidelines, whereas in the show, he takes on a more active role in urging Will to use his ability to save innocent lives. However, we also see that despite him at times recklessly pushing Will to his limits with an almost complete disregard for his mental state, he does feel remorse and responsibility over his turmoil. Him torn between wanting to give Will a sense of structure and wanting to shield him from the horrors of this particular line of work. The show also includes the character of Bella, as well as her terminal cancer diagnosis, showing that Jack too is under an enormous amount of stress, opting to consume himself in his work in order to keep his mind occupied. Introducing Bella also adds to the narrative, allowing an avenue for Hannibal to gain Jack's trust by forming a personal relationship with him and later use that trust to sow the seeds of doubt in his mind about Will's sanity. The show also expands Bella's role to a great degree, us gaining insight into how she is handling her own impending death, as opposed to in the novel, where she is more or less a plot device to develop Jack. If I recall correctly, Bella doesn't even have a single line of dialogue in the entire novel. Us getting to witness the loving and tender nature of their relationship is also very refreshing, considering it would be an understatement to call most relationships on the show horrendously dysfunctional. The show also adds a completely new element to Jack's character that adds a whole other angle to his motivations. We learn that Jack had previously mentored a protege, a trainee named Miriam Lass, who went missing and was presumably killed while pursuing a notorious serial killer known as the Chesapeake Ripper, who, unbeknownst to Jack, is in fact Hannibal. Not only does this explain Jack's at times contradicting attitude towards Will, him simultaneously wanting to redeem himself for losing Miriam by using Will to catch her killer, while also fearing that if he pushes Will too far, he will have lost another agent under his supervision. But it actually amends one of the biggest gripes I have with Crawford in the novels. Consider, in Red Dragon, Jack pulls Will, a seasoned veteran, from retirement in order to help him catch Francis Dollarhide. And while he is successful, it comes at the cost of Will losing his family and becoming a mentally disturbed, drunken mess. And yet, during his hunt for Buffalo Bill, Jack, in his infinite wisdom, is like, considering the last person to interact with Lecter wound up a complete basket case, here's an idea. Let's send a green-as-grass trainee in and hope for the best. This isn't really an issue in the film adaptation of Silence of the Lambs, since it makes no mention of Will or the events of Manhunter, it acting as a standalone narrative. But this is something that always bugged me about Crawford in the books, it making him come off like an irresponsible dick and or a careless idiot. So I'm glad the show was able to amend this simply by having Miriam fall victim to the Ripper before Jack recruits Will to help hunt him down. Some of you may have noted that the character of Miriam Lass seems very similar to that of Clarice Starling. Now, initially, I thought that this was a clever allusion by Fuller, allowing the show to feature the character of Clarice in spirit without trying to stand up against Foster's definitive portrayal of the character in The Silence of the Lambs. However, it turns out that Fuller actually did intend to introduce the character of Starling into the show at some point, but was unable to secure the rights for her or any other character who originates in the novel of The Silence of the Lambs, the adaptation rights to the novel being owned by MGM. However, I actually think this worked out in Fuller's favor. I consider Foster's portrayal of Clarice Starling to be one of the all-time great screen performances, and one that absolutely clears the character of Clarice on the page, at least in my opinion. Thus, while I am not saying it would be impossible, I imagine it would be quite difficult for Fuller's version of Clarice to hold a candle to Foster's. By relegating Clarice's likeness to a more minor character by a different name, it allows her to exist in spirit without the shadow of Foster's performance hanging over her head, as well as keep the narrative's focus mainly on the dynamic between Will and Hannibal, rather than trying to have Will and Clarice share the spotlight. It would be interesting to know what Fuller's original plan was to incorporate Clarice into the story, but as it stands, I think it turned out for the best. As for the other characters who get a facelift from the novels, there is Alana Bloom as Will's friend and colleague. In the novel, an Alan Bloom is mentioned briefly as Will's friend and therapist. Here, Alana takes on a more active role, serving as a foil to Jack. As Jack continues to push Will closer to his mental breaking point, Alana is there to balance the scale and see to it Will has at least one person in his corner who prioritizes his own well-being, her concern for Will amplified due to her romantic feelings for him, feelings she cannot bring herself to act on due to Will's instability. Like Jack, she too is pulled into Hannibal's web, him manipulating her in order to meet his own ends. Dr. Frederick Chilton, immortalized on film by Anthony Heald's brilliantly insufferable portrayal in The Silence of the Lambs, is reined in a bit for the show, which gives a more grounded and measured take on the character. His arrogance and thirst for notoriety still present, but we get a sense he does have at least some semblance of integrity, him being one of the first characters, besides Will, to catch on to Hannibal's true nature, and who sets out to bring him to justice. A refreshing change, considering in silence, his shit-eating grin alone is enough for anyone to actually come to root for a cannibalistic psychopath. Also, and I don't know if this was sort of like a meta joke, considering Chilton is highly implied to have been murdered by Lecter at the end of The Silence of the Lambs, but not only does dude endure perhaps more damage than any other character in the show, from having his organs removed, to getting shot in the face, to getting torched alive, but bro is given the resilience of the fucking Terminator, and survives literally all of it. Ego so big, it literally refuses to give him permission to die. Freddie Lounds is also given a touch more depth. Her of course maintaining the sleazy, opportunistic, ethically murky ways of her novel and film counterpart, but it being evident that she, like Chilton, has a sense of right and wrong, which she sometimes allows to take center stage. Rather than biting the dust early on in our story, as Freddie does in the novel and films, she sticks around all the way until the end, leading to a number of surprising plot turns along the way. However, and with apologies to Laura Jean Korostecki, she is still only the second sexiest actor to portray Freddie Lounds. Across the board, the writers are able to take almost every adapted character from the novel and accentuate their best traits and/or expand on them in interesting and rewarding ways, while still maintaining the essence of each from the source material. This is even true in the case of the more minor characters, namely by gifting Crawford's forensic team members, Brian Zeller, Jimmy Price, and Beverly Katz, each with a distinct and entertaining personality. This is particularly true in the case of Beverly, whose expanded relationship with Will leads to an immensely decisive story beat for Will in Season 2. However, while all the adapted characters I consider to be rewarding to the narrative, the show's original recurring characters are more of a mixed bag. First up, we have Abel Gideon, a former surgeon who was institutionalized following him murdering his wife and her family. Under the care of Chilton, Gideon was, via the use of psychic driving, led to believe that he was the Chesapeake Ripper. He later escapes and clashes with Hannibal, who was none too pleased about having his work attributed to someone else. Gideon is an interesting character as not only does he echo Hopkins' more hammy performance of Lecter, but his despair over losing grasp on who he is brings up an interesting ethical debate baked into the premise of the show itself. A show where we have characters constantly psychoanalyzing about one another's motivations, drives, inner feelings, etc. for some greater end. Not only does Gideon's role show the potential dark side of this practice, how a profiler might allow their own personal vanity or motivations to taint their analysis, but also questions as to how much personal autonomy one should have over their own mind. Following his escape, Gideon goes to work taking vengeance on all of those who had tried to analyze or profile him, later lamenting that due to their influence, he likely will never be able to trust his own mind again. Despite his horrendous crimes, for which he should be and is incarcerated for, does Gideon have the right to his own sense of self, or is his identity itself at the mercy of those who have authority over him? Despite his rather limited role in the series, I do consider Abel a valuable addition to the show. But now, let's talk about Abigail Hobbs, daughter of Garrett Jacob Hobbs. Technically, Abigail is mentioned in the books, but only in passing. Graham mentions that Hobbs' daughter survived her father's attempted murder and simply moved on with her life. But in the show, her role is expanded, with both Will and Hannibal dual surrogate fathers in a sense. Will in particular feeling an immense amount of guilt due to his actions. Now, I think these are interesting angles to explore, how she, Will, and Hannibal make up sort of a twisted family in the wake of her father's death, and how we later discover that Abigail was a reluctant accomplice to her father, which introduces the possibility that she too has the potential to be a killer herself, but these ideas feel more or less half-baked. Besides her acting as a sort of blind spot for Will, him initially refusing to believe she was an accomplice to her father, her only real necessity in the narrative comes at the end of the season when it is implied she is killed by Hannibal, who then proceeds to frame Will for her murder. Other than that, she just kind of meanders around, popping up here and there for whatever reason. I understand what her thematic purpose is, but frankly, you could remove her from the story entirely with little to no impact. Case in point, her basically being completely written out of the story following season 1. I'll go into where she turns up later on. However, I at least appreciate Abigail from a thematic perspective. At least her inclusion is somewhat interesting. Sadly, I cannot say the same about Bedelia De Maurier. Bedelia is introduced as Hannibal's therapist, but as we come to learn, she retired from her practice following the death of one of her patients, a patient referred to her by Hannibal himself. It is highly implied that Bedelia was manipulated by Hannibal into killing said patient. Well, maybe, kind of, I don't really know. Hell, I don't even know if the writers knew from the get-go, considering what actually happened with her patient is left a mystery for the bulk of the series, only it to be finally revealed in the final season that her patient swallowed his tongue, and during her attempt to save him, she just said, fuck it, and just shoves her whole forearm down his throat. It's kind of kinky. To kind of walk back what I just said 10 seconds ago, I guess I do understand Bedelia from a thematic standpoint, her being another one of Hannibal's pet projects, if you will, who, as a result of his influence, has begun to embrace her more malevolent side. But the problem is that, one, this whole will she, won't she thing goes on for way too long, all the way up until the very end of the series. I get they want to portray her as constantly struggling over her conflicting feelings, her at one moment acting as if she is totally down with Hannibal's shenanigans and wants to partake, the next her being horrified by him and her actions implied to be as a result of duress, but this in turn leads to her motivations and personality, instead of becoming more clear and fleshed out, becoming more and more obfuscated. And two, it dampens the novelty of Will and Hannibal's relationship. Will's shifting loyalty and his ambiguous motivations when it comes to Hannibal is, I would say, the primary conflict throughout the series. and it is, by and large, handled extremely well. However, this special relationship between Hannibal and Will loses some of its impact when you consider that Hannibal also sort of has a relationship like this with Bedelia, albeit it being a lot less developed. Frankly, I think the show would be greatly improved without her, even in spite of a strong performance from Gillian Anderson. Anyway, that was a rundown of our principal players, so let's get back to the season. Following Will's killing of Garrett Jacob Hobbs, he is left disturbed and plagued with the possibility that not only is he beginning to lose his sanity, but that he may have enjoyed the killing, doing so instilling him with a sense of power. The season continues in mostly episodic fashion, us bearing witness to a number of truly original pathologies, including a woman who kidnaps young boys and brainwashes them into murdering their own families, a terminally ill patient who turns his victims into guardian angels, and a musician who makes cello strings out of his prey's innards. Perhaps my favorite is the character of Georgia Madchen, a woman who suffers from Cotard syndrome, a disorder in which an individual believes they have lost certain organs or blood, or, in the case of Georgia, that they are actually dead, who, after undergoing treatment, bonds with Will, them finding kinship in that they both know what it is like for their minds to turn against them, Georgia later being killed by Hannibal to further torment and frame Will. However, the true delight of the season is us getting to witness Will and Hannibal working together as a team. The overarching plot of the season sees Will and the BCU team hunting both a copycat killer of Garrett Jacob Hobbs as well as the Chesapeake Ripper, oblivious that Hannibal is in fact both. Over the course of the season, Will slowly befriends and opens up to Hannibal, coming to trust him more than perhaps anyone else, even as Hannibal continues to manipulate Will, conspiring to push past the boundaries of his psyche, going so far as to lying to Will after discovering that he is suffering from encephalitis, wanting to see what will happen if he sends Will's mind into overdrive, as well as those closest to him, making both Jack and Alana wonder if Will has finally reached his breaking point and become a killer himself. Come the end of the season, Will is framed and taken into custody as the copycat killer of Garrett Jacob Hobbs. Despite him now doubting his own sanity, Will clings to the belief that he is being set up, escaping from his incarceration and confiding in the one he trusts the most, Hannibal. Upon walking through the crimes committed by the copycat killer one by one, Will comes to the horrifying realization that Hannibal is the man he has been searching for all along. I know I have already harped on about the decision to give Will and Hannibal an existing relationship prior to Will's discovery of Hannibal's true nature, but I cannot underestimate how it makes said discovery that much more impactful and gut-wrenching. At the beginning of the season, Will was adamant about not letting anyone into the depths of his mind, of not opening up to even those closest to him. But Hannibal was the one and only exception. Come the season's climax, it is not just the horror of Will discovering the truth, but of realizing that the person he has come to depend on the most, the one person he thought was on his side, the one person he trusted enough to be his most vulnerable with, lied to him, manipulated him, betrayed him. But of course, as we know from the source material, not all is lost, since this is the moment where he brings Hannibal to justice, and his true nature is revealed to all. But instead, Jack apprehends Will and brings Will into custody, the season coming to an end with Will incarcerated at the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, with Hannibal still free, his secret intact to all but a man everyone else thinks is a psychotic murderer. In the end, Hannibal is the one in complete control. Not only is this a shocking twist in and of itself, but even more so considering there is no precedence for this in the Lecterverse, with Hannibal being behind bars such an ironclad staple of the series. It is a testament to Fuller and his team's creative courage. Not only do they go to great lengths to pay homage and expand upon Harris's work, but that they are not afraid to subvert expectations and take the story in a wildly new direction. But, of course, being bold enough to simply do something unexpected isn't enough, and thus, Heading into season 2, the question is, as Fuller and his team venture into uncharted territory, are they going to be able to deliver? And the answer to that question is a resounding, oh, fuck yes. Any doubts that I had about Fuller and his writing team being able to stand on their own without the aid of the source material being mercilessly blown the fuck out. With season 2, despite veering wildly from the saga's established lore, being near universally considered by fans to be the best season of the show, with undoubtedly one of the most balls-to-the-wall finales in television history. Season 2 can be neatly divided into 2 arcs. Let's start off with the first, consisting of the first 7 episodes, which, in and of itself, might be one of the finest runs in television history. We pick up with Will incarcerated in the Baltimore State Hospital for the criminally insane, under the watchful eye of Chilton, him slowly beginning to recollect Hannibal's manipulation of him and tries to find a way to prove his innocence and reveal Hannibal's true nature. Meanwhile, Hannibal has taken over Will's role as profiler for the BCU, though he prefers to take a more hands-on approach to taking down his fellow psychopathic killers. All the while, Will is put on trial for the crimes of the copycat killer of Garrett Jacob Hobbs, with both Jack and Alana at odds both with each other and themselves about their responsibility in driving Will to become a killer. Season 2 initially sets itself up as if it plans to follow in Season 1's footsteps, utilizing a procedural episodic structure with a more serialized throughline, namely Hannibal helping the BCU hunt down more psychopaths as Will attempts to find a way to bring Hannibal's crimes to light. But it soon becomes clear that this was intentionally done by the writers to lull the audience into a false sense of security, because come episode 4, shit goes off the fucking rails in the best way possible. Among the first to lend an ear to Will's pleas is Beverly Katz, her going behind Jack's back and consulting with Will on cases, her believing, or at least wanting to believe, that her friend and colleague is not a serial killer. Beverly conducts her own investigation into Will's accusations against Hannibal, and we believe that she will be the key to securing Will's release and bringing Hannibal to justice.
Don't go in there!
A belief that is brutally stamped out when Beverly, upon discovering the truth about Hannibal, is savagely murdered by him, her body frozen and sliced into pieces, which are then put on horrific display to mock both Will and Jack. In case it wasn't obvious by me either censoring or not showing most of the show's carnage to mitigate the risk of this video getting demonetized, Hannibal is insanely gory, rivaling that of premium channel programs like Game of Thrones and The Boys. And to think this shit aired on NBC? I don't know how Fuller pulled this off, but it's a miraculous feat in and of itself. However, despite the show being gruesome enough to make even the most seasoned horror fan lose their appetite, the violence is not simply there for shock value. It also meshes with the story's thematic contentions. While the various bloody spectacles of the series are horrifically disturbing, they are also strangely fascinating and at times even awe-inspiring, portraying violence as something that we as humans are repelled by, yet simultaneously drawn to, which in turn reflects Will's own inner struggle, him being both repulsed and in fear of his disturbing urges, yet compelled by the sense of power acting on said urges instills within him. Speaking of Will's more homicidal side, it is following Beverly's death that all bets are off, both in terms of narrative and the seemingly established structure of the show, as Will shifts his focus from bringing Hannibal to justice to indulging in some good old-fashioned revenge. After consulting with Gideon, Will realizes that in order to even stand a chance at beating his nemesis, he needs to play by the rules of Hannibal's own game. Thus, he settles on finding a way to straight up kill this motherfucker. And lucky for him, he just so happens to have an admirer who is willing to lend a hand. Earlier in the season, a bailiff from Will's trial is killed in a manner similar to the victims of the copycat killer. We are initially led to believe that this murder was carried out by Hannibal to orchestrate Will's release by insinuating that the killer is still at large. But later we discover the murder was actually carried out by an orderly at the hospital named Matthew Brown. Like Miriam Lass, Brown was originally meant to be a direct adaptation of the character of Barney Matthews. However, since Barney makes his first appearance in The Silence of the Lambs, and thus the rights to the character are owned by MGM, the show was not able to feature him. Instead, the series delivers their own take on the character, portraying Matthew as a deranged psychopath himself, desperate for the admiration of Will. And it is here that Will makes his most decisive decision of the series so far, him sicking the deranged young man on Hannibal, ordering him to kill him however he sees fit. Brown kidnaps and prepares to gut Hannibal like a fish, only to be shot and apprehended by Crawford. Despite Will's attempt to make Hannibal bite the dust being unsuccessful, this marks a major turning point for Will. Yes, he had killed before in the case of Garrett Jacob Hobbs, but that was in self-defense. This was to be cold-blooded murder. How ironic that in spite of the numerous attempts by Hannibal to make Will embrace his murderous urges, it would ultimately be Will's attempt to defy him that would lead to him playing right into Hannibal's primary motivation. Us wondering if Will has finally crossed the threshold, if bringing himself to order Hannibal's death will result in his inner bloodlust finally taking hold, if this is truly the point of no return. Following Will's attempt on Hannibal's life, it appears as if Hannibal is in the clear. That is until both Crawford and Chilton both come to suspect that perhaps Will's accusations are not simply the raving delusions of a lunatic, and that Hannibal truly is as Will says he is, with us thinking that this will ultimately lead to Hannibal being brought to justice. But, of course, Hannibal has more than a few tricks up his sleeve. In a masterful two-stroke counterattack, Hannibal deliberately leads Jack to an abandoned farmhouse, where he finds none other than the believed dead Miriam Lass, as well as evidence exonerating Will and instead framing Chilton as the Chesapeake Ripper. When two agents come to question Chilton, Hannibal kills them and plants the body of Gideon, who he had earlier kidnapped and fed to him his own leg, would have been a shame for it to go to waste, in Chilton's home. And then, as the climactic cherry on top, when Miriam is brought in to identify Chilton, we discover that Hannibal brainwashed her into believing Chilton was her captor. In a state of panic, Miriam takes Jack's gun and shoots Chilton in his smug fucking face. With masterful precision, Hannibal simultaneously casts suspicion from himself and orchestrates Will's release, showing the audience just how foolish we were in thinking he was at any point not in complete control. I know that last segment was basically just a synopsis of the first arc of Season 2, but it's just so good, borderline perfect. Each episode swings for the goddamn fences, brazenly defies expectations, builds to a fantastic conclusion epic enough to stand as the season finale, and we are only just over halfway through. As much of a proponent of slow burn storytelling as I am, Hannibal proves that sometimes slamming your foot down on the gas pedal like a belligerent lunatic can be just as, if not more, rewarding. Following his vindication, Will, rather than understandably avoiding Hannibal like the bubonic plague, resumes his therapy with the doctor, the unspoken truth about Hannibal's nature hanging in the air, as the first arc of Season 2 concludes and the second begins. Now, while I consider the first arc of the season to be near perfect, the second is more of a mixed bag, in that it showcases, I would say, the highlights of the entire series, but also is demonstrative of the road bumps that come along with trying to incorporate source material into a singular, comprehensive narrative. Let's start off with the good. The second arc of Season 2 is where I'd say we come to the show's proverbial promise of the premise. Yes, we saw Will and Hannibal work together on cases and carry on their therapy sessions in Season 1, but now, with Hannibal's true nature revealed, every interaction between them is filled to the brim with tension, it appearing at first as if Will now looks to him as a sort of mentor, who can act as his guide as he begins to embrace his growing bloodlust, such as when Hannibal walks Will through him almost executing a serial murderer at his mercy. Hannibal fascinated by Will's evolving nature, wanting to see just how far he can push him, going so far as to try and have Will be killed by one of his former patients, a young man named Randall Tier, who kills his prey while wearing a fully decked out beast suit using fossilized remains, which is metal as fuck, only to have Will surpass his expectations and come out on top. Will emulating Hannibal's own pathology and displaying Randall's corpse in a hideous yet captivating spectacle. Them now each having tried to kill one another on at least one occasion, us bearing witness to the dastardly chess match these two men seem to be playing, where we are not exactly sure if they are trying to defeat one another or are working together to achieve some mutual grand design. Their game seemingly reaching its climax when Freddie Lounds, who has grown to suspect that Hannibal is the Chesapeake Ripper and has taken Will on as his protege, snoops just a little too hard and is murdered by Will, who then proceeds to dine on her with Hannibal, it appearing as if Hannibal has achieved his ultimate goal, Will's metamorphosis finally coming to fruition. Except, plot twist, Freddie is alive and Will is actually plotting with Jack to take Hannibal down, it being revealed that Will resuming his therapy, him playing up his homicidal urges, his killing and displaying of Randall Tier was all part of a ploy to lull Hannibal into a false sense of security so he can ensnare him in a trap and finally bring his grand adversary to justice. Well, maybe. See, what makes the second half of Season 2 so brilliant is that, come the second arc of the season, Fuller and his team could have gone in one of two directions. Either have Will truly agree to become Hannibal's protege and embrace his malevolent side, or have it all be a facade, merely a deception set by Will to take Hannibal down. Each would be an interesting direction in which to take the story. But instead, Fuller and his team said, fuck it, why not both? And this is where, in my opinion, the series reaches its apex, with how it handles Will's characterization. While we are first led to believe that Will's behavior up until now has all been a ruse to take down Hannibal, as we come closer to the finale, his exact motivations and what it is he is actually aiming for begin to blur. Like Hannibal in Season 1, Will soon becomes an enigma to the audience. Maybe he is setting Hannibal up to be taken in by Jack, or maybe he is setting Jack up to be taken out by Hannibal. Or maybe even Will himself is not sure what his exact intentions are, and is simply operating on instinct from moment to moment. Will's primary conflict has been the inner battle between the righteous man he believes he is and the monster he fears he could become. But at this point in the story, it is almost as if these two sides of Will exist simultaneously, battling for control of Will's mind and fate, in turn making him terrifyingly unpredictable. Hannibal, who for so long has been trying to mold a specimen such as Will, sees what might be his ultimate creation come to life, without realizing that he is on the precipice of losing control of said creation, one that may ultimately lead to his own demise. A mad scientist oblivious to the fact that his own experiment has taken on a life of its own. In retrospect, this ends up addressing one of my biggest gripes with the season, which is its opening scene, in which we witness Jack and Hannibal duking it out, leaving Jack on the verge of death before flashing back 12 weeks prior. Now, initially, this felt sort of cheap, like the writers were just trying to bait the audience into sticking around, with the promise that Jack would eventually discover Hannibal's true nature. But now I see that this wasn't a flaw at all. In fact, the idea that Hannibal would eventually have his true nature revealed has been mentioned a number of times throughout the series, that he was always operating on borrowed time, and as long as he kept poking the hornet's nest, his luck would eventually run out. So since this is established as a sort of inevitability, it isn't all that much of a spoiler, because the true dramatic question of the season, and really the series up until now, is not will Hannibal eventually be caught, it is, when push comes to shove, when it comes time to decide between denying or embracing his dark side, what choice will Will make? The show follows up one of the finest, most batshit insane runs in television history with one of the most tense, white-knuckle, character-driven tales I have ever seen. Will, in my opinion, surpassing even Hannibal as the saga's most deftly drawn and complex character. However, now we come to the second half of the season's B-plot, I guess you could call it. Enter Margot and Mason Verger. I want to preface this section by saying that I both respect Fuller and his team's dedication to including as many of the narrative beats and characters of the source material into the television adaptation, and applaud their ability to do so in surprisingly inventive and clever ways. But, as I have already detailed, seeing as the Lecter saga is, to put it kindly, quite the mixed bag when it comes to quality, it seemed inevitable that trying to incorporate as much of it as they could into the series would result in a few bumps. Case in point, how Margot and Mason fit into the larger narrative. Like in the novel, Margot, a patient of Hannibal's, lives in fear of Mason, who is both physically and psychologically abusive, aiming to find some way to free herself from his clutches. Hannibal tries to persuade Margot to kill Mason, but instead she opts to seduce Will, becoming pregnant with what she hopes will be a son so she can circumvent Mason's claim to and inherit her family's fortune. Mason, having caught on to her plan via a tip-off from Hannibal, kidnaps her, removes the fetus, and renders her infertile. Upon discovering this, Will confronts and considers killing Mason out of revenge, but instead convinces him to set up and kill Lecter. Lecter is kidnapped and brought to Mason's farm. Will is offered the chance to slit Hannibal's throat himself, but instead he frees Hannibal, who then proceeds to kidnap Mason and, after pumping him with a fuck ton of psychedelics, has him slice his own face off before snapping his neck, leaving him paralyzed. Rather than turn Hannibal in, Mason begins plotting his revenge with Margot by his side, her still trying to find a way to ensure her inheritance, thus setting up the events of the novel come season 3. So as for prose, the way Fuller and his writers worked the Verger arc into the conflict between Will and Hannibal was pretty damn clever. Obviously, Margot becoming pregnant with Will's child echoes the theme of fatherhood present throughout the series. Hannibal revealing Margot's pregnancy to Mason in an attempt to goad Will into homicidal action is true to his character. And finally, Will's initial decision to use Mason to kill Lecter, only to instead release him, emphasizes the conflict raging within him. Did Will always intend to free Lecter? It all being a scheme to set a trap for Mason and gain Lecter's trust so he could set a trap for him later on? Or did Will sincerely try to set Lecter up, only to change his mind in the moment? And if the latter is the case, why did Will decide to do so? Did his righteous side win out, wanting him to bring Lecter to justice rather than murder him in cold blood, wanting to show Lecter that he can overcome his baleful tendencies? Or could he simply not bring himself to end the life of the man who, despite all the hell and torment he has subjected him to, is perhaps the only one who acknowledges and accepts the part of himself he cannot reveal to any other, who, despite everything, is the only one who truly sees him? It once again plays into Will's moral and psychological ambiguity, making us even more curious and in suspense as to what Will decide to do come the finale. But as for cons, the first I'd say being how much screen time the whole Verger thread takes up. I would even go so far as to guess that if you were a viewer who was not familiar with the source material, you would presume that Margot and Mason were just going to be one-off characters, and then get confused as to why we were spending so much time with these random newbies when all you really want to focus on is the dynamic between Will and Hannibal. As for the portrayals of Margot and Mason, while I am a fan of Catherine Isabel's take on Margot, stripping her of some of her more kooky attributes and character beats, namely her being infertile in the novel due to steroid use, and, of course, her weird-ass dynamic with Barney, and focusing on her trauma and abuse at the hands of Mason, making her a, while morally gray, I'd say overall sympathetic character. However, as for Michael Pitt's performance as Mason, I was less impressed. While every other character adapted from the source material was expanded upon in interesting ways, with each character giving their own fresh take on the character, Pitt's performance feels more or less like an imitation of Gary Oldman's portrayal of the role in Hannibal, hammy, and over the top. Granted, it's not like Mason isn't an over the top character. He trains wild hogs to eat people for Christ's sake. But I'd argue part of the reason Oldman took this approach for the film is due to the fact that him not only being confined to a bed or wheelchair for the entirety of the film, but since his face is so horribly disfigured, it doesn't allow him to emote all that much. Thus, his vocal performance was meant to bring Mason to life in that respect. Also, I always sort of presumed that Oldman's more exaggerated performance was meant to communicate that Mason's fate at the hands of Lecter drove him even deeper into insanity than he already was. But Pitt's performance implies he was always like that even before his encounter with Lecter. That is not to say that Mason wasn't always a psycho, the show incorporating some of his more sinister habits from the book, namely him zesting his martinis with the literal tears of children, but I think it would have been interesting to have Mason begin as a slightly more grounded character who was then driven even deeper into insanity following his fate at the hands of Hannibal. I just feel that Pitt's performance clashes with the rest of the show's sensationalized, yes, but still grounded take on the tale. Whereas when Joe Anderson took over the role of Mason for season 3, he tones the character down a bit, which I think meshes better within the world of the show. I understand this might be a matter of subjective taste, and I know I am in the minority about Pitt's performance, but it just didn't work for me. Regardless, the bigger issue with the Mason and Margot plot is that it feels a bit awkwardly plunked into the narrative, like an instance of the writers trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. I would have preferred if the second half of season 2 spent more time with our bloody boyfriends. Luckily, the Verger plot is wrapped up prior to our grand finale, which focuses solely on the build-up and ultimate conclusion to the looming face-off between Will and Hannibal. To set the stage, let's catch up with our other characters. Despite his initial trust in Hannibal, Jack eventually comes to believe Will's accusations and is able to put aside his guilt over pushing Will to the edge and ultimately being the one to bring him in the first place and agree to help him take Hannibal down. Jack having even more of a personal reason to want revenge on Hannibal. Him coming to realize Hannibal's friendship and him helping Jack deal with Bella's cancer was all simply manipulation. Earlier in the season, Hannibal seemingly tries to goad Bella into committing suicide as a way to put an end to her pain, but then, after she takes an overdose of morphine in an attempt to end her life, Hannibal flips a coin in order to decide whether he should save her, which he does. Sick bastard. Even after being put on leave upon the FBI learning about him allowing Will to mutilate Randall Tier's corpse as part of his plan to trap Hannibal, Jack remains hellbent on taking him down. As for Alana, while she initially was more sympathetic to Will, convinced that his murders were as a result of his sanity being compromised due to his encephalitis diagnosis, her more irate at Jack for pushing Will so hard to the point where his mind basically went haywire, as the season goes on, particularly after Will makes his attempt on Hannibal's life, she begins to wonder if Will truly is a psychopath, and his pleas of innocence were simply performance. She ends up confiding in Hannibal, which leads to them entering a relationship, though she is oblivious to the fact that Hannibal only started sleeping with her to give himself an alibi so he could kidnap Gideon and frame Chilton, and also maybe a little bit to stick it to Will. That's right, I fucked your bitch. Later, Alana is brought into the plan to ensnare Hannibal, as she starts to suspect him herself. Upon learning that Jack has been put on leave and the FBI plans to arrest Will, she tips Will off. Will, his ultimate goal still a mystery, perhaps even to himself, then phones Lecter and warns him that Jack is on the way, presumably in an attempt to entice Hannibal to run. However, Jack arrives before Hannibal can do so, thus leading to the bloody brawl from the beginning of the season, which left off with Jack locked in the wine closet with a grisly neck wound. Alana arrives and finally bears witness to the true nature of the man she respected and revered throughout the course of the entire series. Fleeing from Hannibal, Alana is shocked to discover the alive Abigail, who it is revealed was not killed by Hannibal at the end of last season, who then proceeds to yeet her ass out of a window. And with Jack and Alana clinging to life, Will finally makes his arrival. Upon entering Hannibal's home, Will is in disbelief upon discovering Abigail. And then he finally faces Hannibal, asking him why he didn't run. It seemingly being implied that Will sincerely did want Hannibal to escape. However, Hannibal is heartbroken, as earlier, after detecting the scent of Freddie Lounds on Will, he caught on to Will's plan to betray him. Hannibal reveals that he planned for Abigail to be a surprise for Will, wanting all three of them to run away together so they could be a family. But now that any chance of a happy ending for them is gone, Hannibal proceeds to shatter the teacup once and for all, as he plunges a knife into Will's stomach, leaving him bleeding out on the floor. Will begging Hannibal not to, but him utterly helpless as Hannibal proceeds to slash Abigail's throat, leaving her lifeless body on the floor. Will forced to bear witness to his failure to protect her from a grisly end. As Will begins to fade, the lives of him, Jack, and Alana left hanging in the balance, Hannibal steps out into the rain, having finally shed his mask as Season 2 comes to a close. Again, I know I just sort of gave you a synopsis of the finale and its lead-up, but there isn't much to add when dealing with perfection. I would advise those who cannot hold their breath longer than about 20 minutes to be cautious heading into the finale, because even if you know what happens, seeing it all play out in real time is an exhilarating experience. For sure, one of the finest finales of all time. As for some smaller notes, Season 2 features a loose adaptation of Paul Krendler's character in the form of Cade
It's Katie.
Purnell, played by Cynthia Nixon. Fuller actually wanted to name the character Paula Krendler, but like Clarice and Barney, since the character first shows up in The Silence of the Lambs, they couldn't get the rights. Instead, the name is an anagram of Paul Krendler, thus explaining why it's sort of weird. Purnell. It's like I keep wanting to say Purell. Fuck, I should have gotten them to sponsor this shit. Would have been a dope segue. Anyway, she pops up a few times throughout the season as the mouthpiece for the FBI. Not much to mention beyond that. Despite its more serialized structure, Season 2 also includes its fair share of interesting one-off characters. There is of course Beast Boy Randall Tier, whom I already discussed. We are gifted with guest stars Jeremy Davies, who is featured as a kind but mentally timid man who, after discovering his social worker is a serial killer, gives the prick a taste of his own medicine, and Amanda Plummer, a psychotic acupuncturist who uses her patients as living beehives. And perhaps my favorite of the season, right out of the gate, a man who seeks to make a multicolored collage by using a gaggle of peeps with varying skin tones. The character's look and obsession with skin, I would say a clear allusion to James Gumb, aka Buffalo Bill, who, like Clarice, the show was unable to secure the rights to feature in the show. And now, we unfortunately must once again talk about Bedelia. I truly am sorry for you Bedelia fans out there, but I really do not understand what the hell her deal is. Her motivation's once again completely obtuse. Her at one point reaching out to Will, wanting to help him take down Hannibal, but then in the finale she is seen fleeing with Hannibal overseas, so like maybe she is being coerced. But even if that is the case, what purpose in the narrative does she serve? I know that seems strange to say, considering I just praised the high heavens Will's ambiguity in Season 2, but the difference is that with Will, the tension comes from what choice he will ultimately make when push comes to shove. We know he will have to eventually join or defy Hannibal, and we want to see which road he takes. But with Bedelia, she flip-flops so much, I don't know if they wanted to keep their options open to see where they would take her character, but holy hell does it get redundant. But in spite of my critiques, Season 2 is an absolute blast, an audacious, brilliant season of television, the excellence of which most certainly would stir NBC into ensuring the show a long and fruitful run. But unfortunately, Season 3 would be the show's last, following NBC canceling the show in June of 2015, citing low viewership. I bring this up because I want to give context to what was going on in regard to the show's prospective future to try and make sense of its admittedly uneven and somewhat rushed final season. However, despite Fuller stating that he is open to continuing the series if he's able to find a network to foot the bill, I actually think Season 3, despite its flaws, operates as the perfect conclusion to the series and should remain so. So Fuller's original plan was for the show to run 7 seasons, the first 3 consisting of original material, seasons 4 through 6 being adaptations of Red Dragon, The Silence of the Lambs, and Hannibal respectively, and season 7 being a sort of wrap-up season. At just a glance, I can already see a few issues, namely the fact that Hannibal would be incarcerated for the entirety of season 4 and at least the majority of season 5. Also, would Will exit the story at the end of season 4 with Clarice taking over from season 5 onward? Would they team up? I don't know if Fuller would have followed the source material to a T, but nonetheless, it seemed like an ambitious but misguided idea from the jump. Of course, Fuller being unable to attain the rights for the character of Clarice Starling threw a wrench in this plan, but even come the end of season 2, he was already beginning to reimagine his vision for the show, believing that 6 seasons would be enough to tell the story he wanted to tell. However, while I don't know exactly when NBC informed Fuller of the show's cancellation, it feels very much like Fuller knew, or at least suspected, the show was on the cusp of getting canned. Hence, season 3 was shouldered with the responsibility of encompassing the remaining source material Fuller planned on adapting and serve as a conclusive ending to the show. While I do have my criticisms of season 3, given what Fuller and his team were faced with in terms of the show teetering on the edge of not being renewed, it is still pretty damn impressive what they were able to pull off. The primary reason many consider the final season to be rushed is the fact that it's really 2 shorter seasons smushed together. The first 7 episodes being a loose adaptation of Hannibal, with some Hannibal Rising sprinkled in, and the last 6 episodes being a more faithful adaptation of Red Dragon. While I did note that season 2 also has 2 distinct arcs, as a whole, it still operates as a single season of television, with a consistent dramatic throughline. Namely, whether Will, after discovering the truth about Hannibal, will defy his darker side and bring him to justice, or allow it to consume him and side with his tormentor. In contrast, the first arc of season 3 chronicles how Will ultimately comes to decide to let Hannibal go for the sake of his own humanity, whereas the second sees Will being forced to face him one last time, with we the audience wondering if he will be strong enough to resist Hannibal's influence once again. As season 3 begins, we find our characters separated. Hannibal and Bedelia have escaped to Florence under new identities. Will, still reeling from his traumatizing encounter with Hannibal at the end of season 2, settles on seeking him out, wanting to finally sort out his complex feelings for the man once and for all. Speaking of which, for those of you who may only be somewhat familiar with the show based on stuff you have seen online, you may be asking, so what exactly is the nature of the relationship between Will and Hannibal that evolves over the course of the series? Is it simply built on mutual clinical curiosity? Is there some sort of twisted kinship due to their shared dark pathologies? Or do they just want to fuck each other's brains out? While no 2 fans will probably give you the exact same answer,
they are in love, or they love each other.
Yeah.
That's unquestionable.
Yeah.
I think it's a platonic love, but it's rich. And
if you were to ask me, well, I'd say it's basically all of the above. If I were to try and put it as concisely as possible, the nature of their relationship is based primarily on the idea of complete and utter mutual self-actualization and openness. Throughout the show, Will has a number of visions and nightmares depicting the haunting image of a horrifying stag, which, come season 2, once Will discovers Hannibal's true nature, takes on the likeness of Hannibal himself. The stag seeming to represent both the darkness that exists deep within his psyche that he has tried so hard to fend off, as well as his deepening relationship with Hannibal. Note, come the season 2 finale when Will betrays Hannibal, who then forsakes him, we see the image of the stag bleeding out and dying on the floor, thus signifying the relationship between Will and Hannibal has come to an end, at least for now. I think the significance of the stag, and particularly it later taking on the form of Hannibal himself, is to depict how both Will and Hannibal come to fully and completely understand and see each other as they grow closer, them bearing their souls in total, complete and total intimacy and vulnerability. I think to simply chalk their incredibly complex and deep relationship up to just one element, clinical, professional, romantic, what have you, would cheapen what they share, a relationship that you could say is perhaps even beyond description or classification. Although, I will say, I do get a kick out of the very enthusiastic shipping community of the show, dubbing our primary duo Hannigram. Just look up any clip of Will and Hannibal on YouTube and bear witness to the straight up most down bad comment section you will ever see. Hell, I can't talk. It's not like I haven't played into it throughout the video. Shit, even the writers do. Anyway, I digress. So Hannibal is tripping the life fantastique in Florence, and Will sets out to track him down. As for our other characters, Jack eventually makes his way across the Atlantic to find and confront Hannibal, left with nothing following Bella's passing and wanting some good old-fashioned revenge. Meanwhile, Mason, seeking vengeance of his own, sets a bounty on Hannibal and ends up working with Alana, who also wants revenge, to try and track him down. Like I said, the first arc of Season 3 is a loose adaptation of Hannibal, and thus suffers from some of the same pitfalls, namely that all of our main characters are kept apart for the majority of the season, which, considering the show is at its most gripping when you have two characters face to face toying with each other's minds, everyone being isolated from one another can grow tiresome. The show at least tries to keep things interesting by not immediately revealing the fates of our characters following the previous season's bloodbath finale, us not discovering that Will, Jack, and Alana survive until episodes 2, 3, and 4 respectively. It does admittedly feel gimmicky, but again, I think it is important to note that Fuller was trying to remain faithful to the source material. So, in that respect, I appreciate him finding a clever way to maintain tension, even if it does feel contrived. Although I will say the fact that having all three of said characters survive the damage they took at the end of Season 2 does strain one's suspension of disbelief. At least they finally killed off Abigail for good. At first it was revealed that Abigail survived, getting her throat slashed open, and when she shows up, I audibly exclaimed, "Bullshit!" But later we learn that she is simply a figment of Will's imagination as he comes to grips with her death. Despite the slow pace of the season's first arc, there is at least enough going on to keep things interesting. Once again, we question whether Will seeking out Lecter is out of a desire to attain bloody retribution, or if he wants to reconnect with and ultimately join him. We get round 2 between Jack and Hannibal, seeing Jack finally get to lay a beatdown on him following 2 whole seasons of him manipulating not just him, but also Bella, was supremely satisfying. Even Alana, who I felt sort of fell to the wayside in Season 2, takes an interesting turn. Her initially agreeing to work with Mason, only to later begin an affair with Margot and conspire with her to free her from Mason's clutches. The first arc does still feel a bit padded even at 7 episodes, but builds to a fantastic climax. Hannibal ends up apprehending Will and Jack in Italy, and just as the fellas sit down for a lovely meal, Mason's goons kidnap both Hannibal and Will and bring them back to the States. Mason makes preparations to eat Hannibal after surgically removing and wearing Will's face. Neat, but Margot frees Hannibal, who dispatches with Mason's men and saves Will. Margot and Alana then confront Mason and, in a turn I most certainly did not expect, they reveal that they stimulated Mason's prostate with a cattle prod and stole his sperm, obviously shown off screen.
Coward.
And then kill his ass by drowning him until one of his pet eels swims down his throat. As nutso as this whole plot beat was in the book, I actually commend Fuller for just saying fuck it and going for it. All in all, while it isn't as pulse-pounding and heart-wrenching as the Season 2 finale, that's a hell of a high bar, it's still a fun and satisfying end to the Verger arc, and works much better in the show than it does in either the novel or film. As for some smaller notes, once again Bedelia is just weird. She flees with Hannibal to Italy, and at first we think she is doing so willingly, but then it's implied she is being coerced, but then maybe not. Again, I still don't know what her deal is. Everything I have already said about her still applies here, so I won't harp on about it. Potsy does show up, but in a reduced capacity compared to the source material, which I am quite thankful for, though I am glad they kept the botched appendectomy. And like I mentioned earlier, Joe Anderson replaces Michael Pitt as Mason for season 3, and I actually prefer his performance over Pitt's. His take on Mason more toned down and grounded, which I find fits the vibe of the show better. But now we have to talk about how Hannibal Rising fits into the equation. Despite my less than lukewarm feelings towards both the novel and film of Hannibal, I think there is some stuff in there that has potential. Mason, Margot, Hannibal in Italy. So it was nice to see Fuller and his team do their best to incorporate what they could. However, Hannibal Rising is resoundingly utter trash. So I would have been more than okay if the writers didn't even bother trying to incorporate any of it into the show. And outside of a couple of minute references, there is the fantasy Will has in season 2 where he decapitates Hannibal via horse, which is how Hannibal dispatches with one of the cannibal Nazis in the book and in the film. Hannibal also name drops Misha at some point, but I just figured that was a passing little nod to fans of the source material. I was glad to see they just decided to flat out ignore the book's existence. So you can imagine my utter horror when in episode 3, Will travels to Lithuania to visit Hannibal's childhood home. Will arrives at Casa Lecter and discovers a woman named Chio who is keeping a man prisoner, a man that Hannibal claims killed and ate Misha. Obviously, I was less than thrilled, thinking that the show was going to incorporate the novel's implication that Misha's death was what made Hannibal. However, I was delighted to discover that not only does the show dispel the idea that Hannibal's pathology is as a result of some particular trauma in his life, but they do away with the whole Nazi cannibal shit altogether. It later being implied that while the man did kill Misha, it was Hannibal who ate her to, as he puts it, forgive her. It's also possible that Hannibal has been lying and is just fucking with Chio by telling her the man killed Misha, and that he in fact killed her himself, perhaps after she discovered his true nature, which in turn forced him to silence her, thus explaining the whole forgiving her thing. However, it's all left pretty vague. I like to think that Fuller himself hated the whole Misha quasi-retcon in the source material and decided to sort of like re-retcon it, if you will. So in that respect, I am glad they kept in this part of the story. As for Chio herself, she's kinda lame. So Chio is a character featured in the novel of Hannibal Rising, albeit an extremely minor one. She was just a childhood friend of Hannibal's for a brief time while she was serving as a helper or stewardess to Lady Murasaka or something. In the show, she is said to be trapped, not able to bring herself to kill the man Hannibal says killed Misha, but unable to let him go. Thus, she is condemned to watch over him. Will ends up freeing the man, who then proceeds to attack Chio, who then kills the man in self-defense. While Chio is in despair about killing the man, she now finds herself relieved of her burden, and she travels with Will to track down Hannibal. As for what exactly her relationship with Hannibal is all about, the show doesn't really get into it. It's a possibility that, like Will and Bedelia, she is just another pet project of Hannibal's, him messing with her to see how far he can push her psyche and or just for kicks. Though I am more inclined to believe her devotion to him is due to them knowing each other as children and or her making some sort of oath to Lady Murasaka to take care of him, hence why she refers to herself as Hannibal's protector. Yet, her feelings towards him are contradictory to say the least. Her at one point stating that she wants to see Hannibal in a cage, yet she spends the rest of the first half of the season saving his ass whenever she can. And then at the end, she just pisses off for some reason. Maybe they were trying to set up a similar dynamic to the one between Will and Hannibal, but it just feels like we are retreading old ground. So now we have Will and Bedelia and Chio, who all have this strange love-hate relationship with Hannibal. It's just too damn much. Anyway, back to the finale. Following their escape from Mason's clutches, Will more or less breaks up with Hannibal, realizing that despite his complicated feelings for him, whatever the exact nature of their relationship is, obsessive, intimate, what have you, it will most surely lead to his own destruction, one way or the other. It's a pretty devastating blow to Hannibal, who it seems would have preferred Will shoot him in the face rather than tell him he doesn't like him anymore.
I'm literally about to fucking kill myself.
And sure enough, Hannibal has no intention of letting Will just walk away from him. So the simp motherfucker turns himself in so that, as he puts it,
I want you to know exactly where I am. Where you can always find me.
It's actually pretty romantic if you ignore the coercive undertones. His gesture basically amounting to your toxic ex refusing to block you on socials just in case, you know? As Hannibal is brought into custody, both Will and we the audience know that whatever this is between them is not over just yet. Which brings us to the final run of the show, jumping 3 years into the future as Will and Hannibal are about to cross paths one last time. The last 6 episodes being a surprisingly faithful adaptation of Red Dragon. When a troubled man by the name of Francis Dollarhide, aka the Great Red Dragon, begins a murderous spree of several families, Jack reaches out to the retired and seemingly now well-adjusted Will, who is now married with a stepson, to take him down, which in turn results in him resolving that he has to consult Hannibal one last time. This I personally find to be the most inspired creative decision of the show, to take what was the first chapter of the Lecterverse and have it serve as its grand finale. Although, in a way, it makes perfect sense, considering while this might be the first chapter in Hannibal's story, if we are going off of Harris's book saga, Red Dragon is in fact the end of Will's story, where he is roped back into a life he tried so desperately to leave behind and ends up paying a dire cost. While the last act of the show is quite faithful to the source material, there are still a number of welcome surprises. In contrast to both film versions, the show sticks to the book by having the character of Walter be Will's stepson, as opposed to his biological son. Obviously, this makes more sense from a timeline perspective, but it also echoes the theme of surrogate fatherhood that runs throughout the series. Then there is the scene where Dollarhide arrives at Will's home to kill Will's wife Molly and Walter. If you recall, this does occur in both the novel and film, but only at the end when Will is present. So when Dollarhide rolls up on them alone, I was horrified at the prospect of them being killed off. A really clever way to keep even those familiar with the source material on the edge of their seat. There is also the fantastic scene following Dollarhide's attempted murder of Molly and Walter, where Walter straight up asks Will to kill Dollarhide to ensure their safety. Will realizing that despite how dangerous leaning into his bloodlust is, he might just have to in order to protect those he loves. Then there is the surprise of it being Chilton who is kidnapped and tortured by Dollarhide, whereas it is Freddie Lounds in the source material. Jack takes a bit of a back seat in this last stretch, which I am pretty okay with, as his arc was pretty much wrapped up following him capturing Hannibal. An interesting change sees Alana taking over Chilton's role as director of the Baltimore Hospital for the Criminally Insane, thus residing over Hannibal, their dynamic resembling that of Chilton and Hannibal's in The Silence of the Lambs. However, rather than this being as a result of Chilton just being a prick, Alana has plenty of reason to be so hostile towards Hannibal. We later see that she and Margot have settled down and have a son together, giving them probably the happiest ending of all the characters. Richard Armitage's turn as Francis Dollarhide is fantastic, him probably being the closest and most faithful interpretation of the character from the source material. There is also the added benefit of the show's incredible visuals, emphasizing his transformation into the Red Dragon. The extra time the show offers also allows his and Reba's romance to be more fleshed out. There are a couple of flashbacks that show how Hannibal faked Abigail's death, which I don't really think were all that necessary. Although, Fuller and his team did find a clever way to incorporate what is perhaps the most batshit plot beat of the books, namely Lecter carrying out a therapy session between Clarice and the corpse of her dead father. Beyond just how weird of an idea this is in and of itself, it doesn't really work in the novel for several reasons, but primarily because the idea that Clarice hold some deep-seated anger at her father for dying seems a little strange. I get her being frustrated in general, but not at the dead night watchman, you know? However, Abigail has every reason to be pissed at her father, so at least it makes more sense in that regard. And luckily, despite her absolutely baffling inclusion in the previous seasons, Season 3 finally has the sense to write out, yeah, Bedelia is back. Albeit with her arc, if you could call it that, being a lot less intrusive than in previous seasons. In fact, her therapy sessions with Will are actually pretty interesting, mostly because they act as more of a device to explore Will's inner thoughts about his relationship with Hannibal, and less about trying to make sense of whatever the hell her relationship with Hannibal is, which, frankly, again, I don't even know if the writers fully have a grasp on. But of course, the main focus of our final stretch is Will coming face to face with Hannibal, and we the audience wondering if this will either end with Will finally leaving him behind, or him being pushed over the edge once and for all. What is so brilliant about having this arc serve as the finale of our story is that the preceding events of the series coat and deepen the context of every scene they share together. While the Will and Lecter scenes are the highlights of both the novel and film adaptations of Red Dragon, most of Will and Lecter's history is either told to us or is merely implied. But in the show, every interaction, every word they speak to each other has the subtext of all the preceding events of the series dangling over it. Far more so than the novel or films, we truly understand the weight and risk of Will allowing himself even to be in the mere presence of Lecter. It also implicitly recontextualizes Lecter's actions and motivations, namely the scene where Lecter goads Dollarhide into going after Molly and Walter. While in the novel and in the films, this comes off as more or less motivated by revenge, given Hannibal's actions throughout the series, we wonder if this is merely another effort by him to try and push Will closer to the edge, to try and make him kill once again, to make him rediscover his bloodlust. While it initially appears as if Will has left Hannibal behind and has found peace in his new life with Molly and Walter, it is palpable that whatever is between them isn't over. Will openly admitting that he still feels a level of twisted kinship with the man who caused him so much harm, horror, and grief, but who is also perhaps the only one who sees and accepts the darker side that exists within him. One we come to surmise may not be as dormant as Will would like us to believe. Case in point, when he is setting up the trap for Dollarhide later in the season, it is heavily implied that Will, perhaps even subconsciously, signaled to Dollarhide to go after Chilton. However, despite the show being majorly faithful to the novel for its majority, come the finale, we see the story completely go off the rails, in a good way, that leaves even us book readers biting our nails. Following Dollarhide's supposed death, he, rather than attempting to kill Will and his family at their home, confronts Will alone. But rather than wanting to kill Will, Dollarhide, feeling betrayed by Hannibal, goes along with Will's plan to set Hannibal up once and for all. But, of course, seeing as this is the third time Will has tried to do this, we know shit ain't gonna go according to plan. Will convinces Jack to set up a trap for Dollarhide by transporting Hannibal to a different location. The idea being that Dollarhide will ambush the transport in an attempt to get to Hannibal, thus drawing him out into the open. However, Will states his true intention is for both Dollarhide and Hannibal to be killed at the scene, thus ensuring his and his family's safety. But, of course, we have no reason to believe this is Will's actual intention, conscious or otherwise. Perhaps he wants to bring Dollarhide to justice, perhaps he does want both Hannibal and Dollarhide to be killed, or perhaps this is simply an elaborate ruse to orchestrate Hannibal's escape. Following the plan going awry, with Dollarhide killing several federal agents who were escorting Hannibal before fleeing, leaving only Will and Hannibal alive, the two men retreat to Hannibal's shoreside home, where Hannibal is said to have kept both Abigail and Miriam last as they await their looming final confrontation with Dollarhide. Will and Hannibal's final conversation a reflection of their time together, both recognizing that despite everything, despite all the horror, the betrayal, the death, they still feel a connection. of two people who perhaps truly see each other more than anyone else either of them has ever known. Their reunion is cut short, however, as Dollarhide makes his final assault, quickly bringing Hannibal to his knees. And, in the moment, faced with Hannibal's imminent demise, Will makes his choice, as both he and Hannibal take on Dollarhide in a bloody fierce knife fight, which ultimately ends with Will and Hannibal taking the Red Dragon down once and for all. Both bloodied and injured, Will and Hannibal embrace, Hannibal stating,
"This is all I ever wanted for you, Will."
Will reflecting on finally sharing in their mutual bloodlust together, and thus making it appear as if Hannibal has finally won. He has finally fostered Will and made him reach his final form, his full potential, to embrace his truest self. Will seeing the horrific beauty in allowing his darkest, most primal desires to be unleashed, and to have someone by his side who accepts him utterly and completely. But then... So, let's talk about this. Now, as I already mentioned, Fuller is open to continuing the series, thus implying that Will and Graham somehow survived their plunge off the cliff. Or I suppose he could chalk it up to a fantasy existing only in Will's mind. The idea that Will and Hannibal survived is supported by both the after-credits scene, where Bedelia is seated at a table set for three, as she and her mystery guests prepare to dine on her own leg, Bedelia clutching a knife in her lap, implying that both Will and Hannibal are present, and she plans to kill one or both of them upon their return. Although, this scene could be interpreted as if Bedelia is awaiting the arrival of Will and Hannibal, not knowing they are both dead following their fall off the cliff. Also, there is a deleted scene where it appears Jack is, per the script, lying in wait, thus implying he plans to continue to pursue both Hannibal and Will. However, again, this could be interpreted as Jack, like Bedelia, not knowing that both Will and Hannibal are dead. Regardless, the point I'm getting at is that there are ways that Fuller could continue the series with Will and Hannibal surviving if he really wanted to. However, I consider the interpretation of the ending where both Will and Hannibal plunge into the ocean to their deaths to be a perfect ending to the series. Will finally indulging in his most deepest desires he has spent the entire series running from, only to immediately cast both he and Hannibal into the sea. Thus, the question is posed as to what Will's motivations are in doing so. Was this a moment of sudden clarity, Will realizing that he has allowed his inner darkness to consume him, and, unable to bear living as a monster, decides to end his own life, taking Hannibal with him? Did Will realize in that moment that as long as Hannibal was still alive, both Molly and Walter would never be safe, and thus this is a self-sacrifice? Was it a sudden impulse to finally take revenge on a man who caused him so much pain and turmoil? Was it simply his bloodlust taking over, giving into the desire to claim another life, even at the cost of his own? Was this simply a metaphor for Will and Hannibal killing together, quote-unquote, sending them over the edge, aka bringing them to one hell of a simultaneous climax, if you know what I mean? What exactly Will's motivation is in this final moment is not elaborated upon and will likely never be given a definitive answer. Regardless, the ending still, in my eyes, serves as a perfect resolution to both Will and Hannibal's relationship. Hannibal seeing in Will the potential for someone he could share in his desires, who could see him fully and completely, but who was ultimately shocked at just how unpredictable Will would prove himself to be. Hannibal's fostering of his ultimate creation in turn leading to his own end, him finally facing the wrath of the Lamb. However, perhaps this is what Hannibal wanted all along, someone who he could share his total self with before allowing that same person to take from him what is most dear and precious to him, his own life. Whatever the exact nature of either Will or Hannibal's motivations, this final moment leads to the inevitable yet simultaneously intimate end to their story. Will and Hannibal sharing so much with one another throughout the series, including, in the end, death itself. I can't say that if season 4 does ever happen, that I won't be sad for it, especially if both Dancy and Mikkelsen decide to return. But for now, the ending of season 3 stands as one hell of a satisfying cap-off to one hell of a fantastically macabre series. So, I originally planned to have this section just be a wrap-up of my thoughts on the series, but during my research, I stumbled upon a completely separate true life saga so treacherous that it puts even the fictional events of Fuller's series to shame. Such a ludicrously audacious series of events that I couldn't help but dedicate an entire segment to its unfolding. Now, as I am sure is very obvious by this point, the biggest issue I would say Fuller and his team had in adapting the source material was the fact that it is quite uneven in quality, to put it lightly. So, of course, the question is, what's the deal? What explains the scathing drop in quality between The Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal? Did Harris simply lose the juice? Did he just write Hannibal as a greedy cash grab? Was he kidnapped and subjected to a forced hemispherectomy? Well, I think I can put forth an at least somewhat sensical explanation. One that all has to do with one man. No, not Thomas Harris, a man who shall serve as the subject of our next and final segment of the video. One that I have tastefully and respectfully entitled Hello everybody, this is Dino De Laurentiis, producer of over 500 films over the course of his 7+ decade career. While you may have never heard of Dino until just now, he has had a hand in bringing to the screen some of the greatest pieces of celluloid to ever grace the medium. But before you think about lending even a shred of goodwill towards old Dino here, I want to share with you a story that begins in 1984, the year that Dino formed his own production distribution company, the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group. One of the first films Dino released with said company being none other than Manhunter. It turns out Dino was the one who insisted on changing the novel's title for the film adaptation, even though both Mann and Cox thought the new title was stupid as fuck. Come to think of it, it does seem like Dino's reasoning was pretty silly. Putting aside the whole, Bruce Lee film confusion thing, why would he think anyone would associate this film with Year of the Dragon? A film that wasn't exactly wildly popular, given the fact that it bombed at the box office. Why did Dino seem to make such a fuss over this one film in particular? Okay, I get it now. So after Manhunter failed to turn a profit, guess the title change didn't help after all, Dino didn't take it all that well. Him stating, Manhunter was no Red Dragon.
Hey Bob, you remember the other day you were asking me what the definition of irony was?
So much so that 2 years later, when Harris published The Silence of the Lambs, neither Dino nor his business partner and later wife, Martha De Laurentiis, had any interest in adapting it to the screen. Instead, Orion Pictures, who had purchased the film rights to The Silence of the Lambs before the book was even published, decided to move forward with their own adaptation. Fun fact, Gene Hackman was initially attached to direct and star as Jack Crawford in the film. However, there was one small problem. See, if it wasn't already obvious for me bringing it up several times over the course of the video, adaptation rights can get a bit tricky. While Orion Pictures purchased the rights to adapt the novel of The Silence of the Lambs, and thus owned the rights to any characters who originated in said novel, namely Barney Matthews, James Gumb, and, of course, Clarice Starling, said rights do not extend to characters who appeared in a previous piece of media, including Hannibal Lecter, who makes his first appearance in Red Dragon, the rights to which were owned by the De Laurentiis Group. Fucky, I know. So Orion Pictures had to secure the right to the character of Hannibal Lecter before they could move forward with their film. Thus, they approached Dino, who decided to lend them the rights to Lecter for the price of nothing. He lent them the rights to Hannibal Lecter
for free.
Now, it is completely possible that Dino decided to do so solely out of the kindness of his heart. with Martha stating, "You could be terrible and say no, or you could demand money," which was kind of, why be greedy? Or you let them use it, and if it's successful, your asset has value. Regardless, given the fact that Dino and Martha, neither of whom even bothered to read the novel, had no interest in adapting The Silence of the Lambs, I think it is safe to say that at least part of their motivation for handing over the rights for free was that they simply didn't think the property had any legs. That, like Manhunter, it would be a dud, a bomb, a colossal cinematic failure.
Head tally for The Silence of the Lambs.
To Jonathan Demme for Silence of the Lambs.
Jodie Foster, The Silence of the Lambs.
Anthony Hopkins and The Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah. Suffice to say, this might be one of the biggest fumbles in the history of filmmaking. However, now the De Laurentiis were sitting pretty, seeing as, while they had no hand in the production of The Silence of the Lambs, they still owned the rights to the character of Hannibal Lecter, and thus were entitled to the spoils produced by any future film productions in which he appears. But there was just one problem. There were no more novels featuring Lecter for them to adapt, at least not at the time. Eager to bring Hannibal to the big screen once again, Dino and Martha would visit Harris at his home in Florida on an annual basis to check up on the status of Harris's next novel, all the way up until the release of Hannibal in 1999. Okay, so I am going to be super good faith here and not insinuate that either Dino or Martha in any way tried to pressure Harris into writing Hannibal so they could capitalize on their ownership of the film rights of Hannibal Lecter. It's completely possible Harris was already planning on writing a sequel all on his own. It is entirely possible that this was just a friendly check-in, that they were patient and kind, and allowed Harris to work at his own pace. However, I just want you to keep this in mind as I continue to chronicle, particularly Dino's behavior during the production of the subsequent Lecterverse films, and then you can draw your own conclusion. Following the release of Hannibal, the De Laurentiis went right to work getting the film adaptation off the ground. Well, actually, that's not correct. They didn't even wait for the novel's release, Dino having sent the manuscript to Foster, Hopkins, and Demme before the novel was even published, so yeah, suffice to say they were eager to get this shit rolling. However, while Hopkins agreed to reprise the role, as I already mentioned, both Foster and Demme declined. Upon receiving word from Demme's agent that Demme had no interest in returning for the sequel, Dino responded, "When the Pope dies, we create a new Pope. Good luck to Jonathan Demme, goodbye." Which, at least to me, sounds really dismissive, but maybe I'm just being sensitive. However, after learning that Foster turned down the role to return as Clarice Starling, Dino stated that the film was better off for it because he didn't feel like she was the correct choice for the character.
Well, to be honest, I must say, from when I read the book, I said Jodie Foster never go to do this movie, and in my personal opinion, it's better for the movie because she's not correct for the movie, for the character.
Okay, so let me just get this straight. Both Demme and Foster, who, mind you, were two of the main reasons for the success of The Silence of the Lambs, a film whose creation you had no hand in and is the only reason your asset has any potential value, turn down the offer to return, and instead of trying to understand why, your response is, who gives a shit, who needs them? I also find it depressingly hilarious that the novel's ending, which is the whole reason both Demme and Foster declined to return, ultimately ended up getting scrapped anyway. Despite receiving mixed reviews, Hannibal ended up earning a nice juicy profit for the De Laurentiis, who less than a year later set out to readapt Harris's debut Lecter novel, this time keeping the OG title of Red Dragon, which again is hilariously ironic when you recall that it was Dino who decided to forgo said title back in '86. It is said that most of the cast were hesitant to sign on, only agreeing to do so after Ted Talley returned to pen the script. Talley stated that he did so as he figured the film would serve as the final chapter in the Lecter saga. Quote, "I don't want to do another one myself. I like the idea of a trilogy, and if it ends here, it will end gracefully. I would hate to see this become Hannibal Lecter 13. Oh, Ted, honey. Regardless, the film fared pretty well with critics and was able to turn in a decent profit, though notably a good chunk less than Hannibal. And thus, ultimately, the De Laurentiis got what they wanted out of their asset. And so with no more Lecter stories to adapt, maybe this was when they decided to put the franchise to bed?
Fuck that shit!
Despite Dino stating during the pre-production of Hannibal that had Hopkins not agreed to reprise the role of Lecter, the project would have not ended up materializing, following the release of Red Dragon, Ted Talley stated that he believed even if Hopkins didn't agree to return for another turn as Lecter, nothing would have stopped Dino from making another film if he had already made up his mind. With Martha echoing these statements, stating, "If you don't have Tony Hopkins playing Lecter, ultimately a movie could be made, but a totally different movie, maybe set in another time, 20 years earlier. Establish a much younger time frame, a much younger actor." And I think we all know where this leads. So I'd say it is clear at this point that the De Laurentiis are driven not any sense of artistic integrity, but by maximizing their bottom line, even if it means running this franchise into the ground. But having adapted every novel featuring Lecter they possibly could, twice in the case of Red Dragon, it appears as if they have nowhere to go and it is time for the saga to come to an end. And finally we arrive at one of the most unbelievable instances of utter scumbaggery I have ever seen. So remember how I mentioned that I can't say for sure whether Harris had planned to write Hannibal on his own or if the De Laurentiis pressured him into it? I bring this up to contrast it with the conception of Hannibal Rising, which Harris openly stated he had no interest in writing. It was in fact Martha who approached Harris with the idea for a Lecter prequel story herself, wanting him to write a novel which could then be adapted into a film. But Harris was adamant about finally putting the franchise to rest. And that is when Dino, eager to squeeze as much blood from the proverbial stone as he could, took matters into his own hands, telling Harris, "If you don't do the prequel, I will do it with someone else. I don't want to lose this franchise." What we have here is Dino blatantly trying to coerce Harris into writing a prequel novel under the threat of co-opting his own creation. Mind you, this isn't some Hollywood rumor. Dino openly admitted this to Entertainment Weekly. In the end, Harris wrote Hannibal Rising, which received lukewarm reviews upon its publication in 2006, and the film adaptation was made in 2007, which received shit reviews and failed to match the financial success of the previous adaptations, which I presume is what finally led Dino to be done with the franchise. Although he passed away 3 years later, so who knows, maybe bro was planning on bullying Harris into another go. I wouldn't put it past him. Now, I know I keep bringing this up, and I apologize, but while I cannot say with certainty that Dino and Martha pressured Harris into writing Hannibal following the success of the film adaptation of The Silence of the Lambs, given the behavior that Dino in particular displayed throughout the following years, I can't say that it's all that much of a stretch to believe they were capable of doing so. There are even some who theorize that Harris purposely added so much batshit insanity into Hannibal as a fuck you to Dino and Martha, hoping to sabotage their inevitable film adaptation. I can't say for sure if Harris would have gone this far to stick it to the two of them. However, I will say I do find something a bit suspicious about the scene where Hannibal and Clarice both dine on Crenler's brains towards the end of the book. Could it be possible that this is an allusion to one of those annual dinner visits that Dino and Martha made to him? Hannibal and Clarice, representing Dino and Martha, cutting open the head of Crenler, representing Harris, and dining on his brain matter, a metaphor for them trying to pry more intellectual property from him so they could use it for their own selfish ends? Okay, I think I'm getting a bit too psychoanalyzing for my own good. So why did I spend so much time chronicling all this? Because I wanted to establish that when Fuller and his team set out to make a series that encapsulated the entirety of Harris's saga, they weren't pulling from a singular artistic vision, but rather a franchise of which a not insignificant portion was developed beneath a black cloud of greed, spite, and coercion, which in turn makes what the show ended up accomplishing, taking fibers and threads from each individual chapter and crafting them into something so much more, so damn miraculous. After reading up on the history of the Lecterverse, I see the series as a redemption of sorts for the saga, and proof that creative integrity will always trump corporate avarice. Look at me using fancy words. Anyway, thanks for sticking around. If you haven't already, treat yourself by checking out Hannibal and have yourself one hell of a macabre time. Take care now.